Somewhere right now, someone is reading this in the dark. Phone brightness turned all the way down, eyes getting heavy. And somewhere else it's morning, coffee in hand, the world just waking up. That's the strange thing about a question like this one. It doesn't care what time zone you're in. It doesn't care if it's midnight or noon. The question just sits there, quiet, patient, waiting for anyone curious enough to ask it. Here's the question. What if this isn't the first time humans built something like civilization? What if, somewhere back in the deep folds of time, there were others before us? Cities that rose, systems that worked, people who looked up at the same stars we do, and then, for reasons we don't fully understand, it all came apart. Not slowly faded, but reset, wiped clean enough that almost nothing survived into written memory. That's the premise we're going to sit with tonight. Not as fact, not as conspiracy, but as a genuine historical puzzle, one that real archaeologists, geologists and climate scientists actually argue about, even if they'd never phrase it the way pop culture does. We're going to ask calmly and carefully whether the story we tell about human history, the one that starts around 5,000 years ago with the first cities and the first writing, is actually the whole story, or just the part that happened to survive. Before we go further, if you're listening to fall asleep, that's exactly what this is for. So, tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I love reading those comments. It's Tokyo at sunrise. It's Chicago at midnight. It's someone in Lisbon who can't sleep either. All of us drifting off to the same ancient mystery at completely different hours. And if you want the smoothest way to listen, the show streams best on Spotify. Links in the description. That's the easiest way to support what we're doing here without spending a cent. Now back to the question. Tonight, we're not chasing certainty. We're weighing evidence. Real evidence. The kind written in ice cores that record thousands of years of climate swings. The kind buried in stone at places like Göbekli Tepe, where hunter-gatherers apparently built monumental structures thousands of years before agriculture was supposed to exist. The kind hidden in flood myths that show up almost word for word in spirit from Mesopotamia to China to the Americas, cultures with no contact, telling suspiciously similar stories about the world ending in water. We'll look at sea levels that dropped hundreds of feet during the ice ages, exposing entire coastlines where humans very likely lived. Coastlines that are now underwater, erased from the archaeological record, simply because the ocean swallowed them. We'll look at genuine collapses history did record, the Bronze Age collapse, the fall of empires, moments when writing stopped, cities emptied, and knowledge visibly vanished within a single generation. And through all of it, we'll ask the same gentle question from different angles. If an earlier civilization really did exist, and really did fall, what would we actually expect to find? Would there even be anything left to find? Or is the truth simpler and stranger that history isn't hiding one dramatic reset, but hundreds of smaller ones, forgotten so thoroughly that they only look, from far enough away, like a single missing chapter? So get comfortable. We're drifting back, way back, past the pyramids, past the first cities, past even the first written word. Before we can ask whether we're living after some hidden reset, we need to slow down and ask a much simpler question. What do we even mean by civilization? Because the word gets used like it's obvious, like everyone agrees on what it means. And they really don't. Archaeologists have been arguing about this definition for over a century, and honestly, the arguing itself tells you something important. For some researchers, civilization simply means cities. Dense, permanent settlements where thousands of people live close together, sharing infrastructure, dividing labour, specialising in trades beyond just hunting and gathering. Under that definition, civilization requires walls, streets, granaries, maybe a marketplace. For others, the defining feature isn't the city at all. It's writing. The moment a culture starts recording its laws, its taxes, its stories, in symbols that can be read by someone who wasn't there when the words were spoken, that's the line. Before writing, we're in prehistory. After writing, we're in history. Neat, except it isn't neat at all, because plenty of sophisticated societies never developed writing the way Mesopotamia or Egypt did, and we don't usually call them primitive for it. Then there's the definition built around the state. Centralized authority, hierarchy, someone collecting taxes, someone enforcing laws, someone claiming the right to organize thousands of lives from the top down. Other researchers focus on trade networks instead, arguing that civilization really begins when goods, ideas, and people start moving across long distances in organized, repeatable patterns. Copper from one region, tin from another, pottery styles spreading hundreds of miles because someone figured out how to move things efficiently and reliably. And still others point to technology itself. Irrigation systems, metallurgy, monumental architecture, the physical evidence that a group of people had organized enough knowledge and labor to build something that outlasts a single lifetime. Here's the uncomfortable truth. None of these definitions fully agree with each other. Göbekli Tepe, which we'll get to later, has monumental architecture, but apparently no agriculture and no writing. Some Bronze Age trade networks moved goods across 1,000 miles without ever forming what we'd call a unified state. So when someone claims we are the seventh civilization, the very first question worth asking is, according to which definition? Because if civilization means cities and writing, the count looks one way. If it means any organized society complex enough to leave a lasting mark on the landscape, the count looks completely different, and suddenly the number 7 becomes a lot more slippery than it sounds. The same problem shows up with the word collapse. In casual conversation, collapse sounds apocalyptic, an entire civilization vanishing overnight, cities emptying in a single generation, knowledge disappearing like it never existed. And sometimes that did happen. But historians make an important distinction here, one that's easy to miss if you're not paying attention. There's a difference between a regional collapse, one city, one kingdom, one trade network falling apart while the rest of the world continues more or less as it was, and something far rarer, a widespread discontinuity where multiple interconnected societies break down at roughly the same time for compounding reasons, leaving gaps in the historical record that stretch across an entire region rather than a single site. The Bronze Age collapse, which we'll spend real time on later, is the classic example of that second kind. Multiple palace centres across the eastern Mediterranean falling within decades of each other. That's genuinely rare in history. Most collapses are smaller, messier, and far more local than the word implies. A drought here, an invasion there, a trade route that dries up because the source of tin ran out 300 miles away. These things ripple outward, but they don't usually erase memory across an entire hemisphere. And that brings us to the trickiest word of all, reset. Because a reset implies something even bigger than collapse. Not just a civilization falling, but the thread of memory itself being cut so thoroughly that the next civilization has to start over almost from scratch, unaware that anything came before it. That's a much heavier claim, and historians are, understandably, very cautious about it. Not because they're closed-minded, but because history rarely moves in single, clean strokes. It moves in layers, climate pressure combined with disease, combined with trade disruption, combined with internal politics, combined with something as unpredictable as a bad harvest 3 years running. When historians study collapse, they almost never point to one cause. They point to a pile of pressures arriving at the same time, each one survivable alone, devastating together. So, when we ask whether we're the seventh civilization living after some singular unrecorded reset, We have to hold two ideas gently at the same time, without letting either one cancel out the other. Yes, dramatic world-altering events really have happened in the deep past. Climate shifts severe enough to nearly erase our species. Floods, droughts and eruptions capable of ending entire regional cultures within a lifetime. That part isn't speculation, it's documented. But it's also true that history rarely produces total amnesia. Even in the worst collapses we know about, some threads survive. Some memory limps forward, distorted, fragmented, but not entirely gone. Which means the real question isn't whether something big happened once long ago. It's whether something big happened and left absolutely nothing behind, no trace, no myth, no whisper. And to answer that fairly, we first need to understand exactly how history survives at all, and just as importantly, exactly how it disappears. If you want to understand how history can vanish, you have to start with something very unromantic: garbage. What people throw away, lose or leave behind, and what the planet decides to keep. Archaeology, underneath all the mystique, is just carefully reading very old garbage. Broken pots, discarded tools, animal bones, fire pits, stains in the soil where wooden posts once stood. And the first big thing you learn when you look at that record is that it is brutally unfair. Some materials win the preservation lottery. Others might as well have never existed. Stone is a winner, especially hard stone, like flint or obsidian. A well-made stone tool can sit in the ground for 1,000,000 years and come out looking almost fresh. Fired clay is another champion. Once you bake clay into pottery or bricks, you're essentially turning mud into rock. Unless someone grinds it up or the whole landscape erodes away, it just sits there, stackable, countable, dateable. Caves, too, are kind of cheaters in this game. They're sheltered, stable, and often dry. If your ancestors painted on cave walls or buried their dead deep underground, there's a decent chance some part of that is still there. Not because caves are magical, but because they're less exposed to wind, water, sunlight, and roots. They're pockets of slow time inside a fast-changing world. Now compare that to almost everything that makes up your world. Paper disintegrates. Even under good conditions, it rots, moulds, gets eaten by insects, burns in seconds. Wood decays. Leather, cloth, rope, all the organic fibres that once carried technology and culture return to the soil. Metals corrode. Iron, especially, can turn into an unrecognisable lump of rust in just a few centuries, unless it's protected. And digital media? Hard drives, magnetic tape, solid-state memory, those are incredibly fragile over long periods. They depend on a technological ecosystem to be readable at all, and that ecosystem is even more brittle than the devices. So when we look backwards and say there's no evidence for X, what we often really mean is there's no evidence for X in materials that can survive tens of thousands of years without active maintenance. That's a very different statement. Now add one more harsh editor: geography. For most of human history, people have loved the same kinds of places. Coastlines, river valleys, deltas, anywhere that combines fresh water, fertile soil and easy transportation. That's where dense populations form, where trade networks knot together, where whatever counts as civilization at the time is most likely to cluster. Those are also, unfortunately, some of the least stable places on Earth. Rivers change course. They flood, they cut new channels, they bury old settlements under meters of silt, or wash them away entirely. Deltas subside under their own weight. Sediments pile up, land sinks, sea level creeps in, and towns that once sat above the waterline end up drowned under layers of mud. Coastlines erode, storm by storm, century by century, chewing away at whatever was built too close to the edge. And then there's sea level itself, During the last glacial maximum, huge volumes of water were locked up in ice. Global sea level was more than 100 meters lower than today. Vast coastal plains existed where there is now only water. If you wanted to put a speculative ancient port city somewhere we can't easily check, that would be the place, on a shelf that is now under 50 or 80 meters of ocean. This doesn't mean there were hidden super cities there. It just means that when we talk about the known archaeological record, we're already dealing with a skewed sample. The parts of the planet most attractive to complex societies are also the parts that erase and overwrite themselves most aggressively. Rebuilt, flooded, dredged, buried, diced up by later construction. The archive on land is incomplete. The archive underwater is only barely explored. Even when conditions are good, the record still develops what archaeologists sometimes call silent centuries. You dig down through the layers of a site, and you expect a more or less continuous sequence. This style of pottery, then that one, then the next. But sometimes there's just nothing, a gap in the stratigraphy. A period where, according to the soil, nobody was there. Except that usually doesn't mean nobody was there. It often means the site was abandoned and people moved a few miles away to higher ground, or a later occupation cut into and destroyed the older layers, or erosion scraped off a chapter before the next chapter was written on top. Sometimes an entire region has these gaps, centuries where texts are scarce, layers are thin, monuments stop being built. The people didn't vanish. The things that preserve well stopped lining up in ways that are easy for us to find. So how do you study a past that mostly used perishable materials in landscapes that like to erase themselves? You look sideways, you infer, you map settlement patterns, where people chose to live, how dense those places were, how long they were occupied. A cluster of large, long-lived sites suggests a complex social structure, whether or not we have a single written word from them. You study diet, animal bones, plant remains, isotopes in teeth and bones. All of that tells you what people were eating, how mobile they were, whether they relied on farming, herding, fishing, or trade. You track trade routes without a single shipping manifest. Exotic stones, shells from distant coasts, metals from specific ore deposits showing up far from their source. You follow the trail of obsidian blades or copper ingots or particular pottery styles, and you reconstruct invisible roads across the landscape. And in the last few decades, you add genetics to the mix. DNA from ancient skeletons, compared to living populations, reveals migrations and mixtures that would never show up in inscriptions. Whole movements of people who left no texts at all but left their genes scattered across continents. Put all of this together and a pattern emerges. When change happens, when societies rise, transform or fall, the signals are rarely clean and singular. You don't usually get one neatly burned layer saying, civilization ended here, and then a long, empty pause before the next one starts. Instead, you get scattered clues, a settlement that shrinks, another that grows, dietary shifts, new pottery, old trade routes going quiet while new ones light up, a genetic signature spreading through one region and fading in another. If a true reset ever happened, something big enough to disrupt memory across a huge area, we probably wouldn't see it as a single dramatic stripe in the earth labelled recessed event. We'd see a tangle of partial signals, abandoned coasts, reoccupied highlands, interrupted trade, changing diets, moving peoples. A messy transition, not a clean break. And that's the tension we have to carry forward. The past is neither fully knowable nor completely opaque. It's like listening to a conversation through walls. Some words come through perfectly. Others are muffled to the point of guesswork, and long stretches are silent. To talk honestly about missing civilizations or hidden resets, we have to respect both sides of that. the parts we can hear clearly, and the long, quiet gaps where we're inferring shapes in the dark. With that in mind, we can start walking back through the actual timeline archaeologists and geneticists have assembled before the first cities, to see what the baseline looks like before we start imagining what might be missing. If you unroll that baseline timeline like a scroll and smooth it out on the table, the first thing you notice is how long it is before anything that looks like a city shows up. For most of that scroll, we're not dealing with farmers or bricklayers or kings. We're dealing with what archaeologists call Upper Paleolithic humans. Still hunter-gatherers, still mobile, but already recognizably us. By around 50,000 years ago in Africa, and a bit later in Eurasia, the garbage record gets weirdly rich. Suddenly you have art, not just doodles, but deliberate, repeatable symbols. Engraved lines that follow patterns, beads drilled from shells, pigments ground and mixed, sometimes in carefully stored containers. In places like Blombo's Cave in South Africa, or the caves of France and Spain, people are spending real time and effort making things that don't feed you, don't shelter you, don't stab mammoths. They feed something else alongside the art. You get long-distance exchange, obsidian, shells, rare stones moving 100, 200, sometimes more than 300 kilometers from their source. No trucks, no horses, just feet and time, passing objects hand to hand through chains of relationships. This tells you something crucial. Upper Paleolithic humans aren't living as isolated little bands. They're part of wide social networks held together by marriage, alliances, shared stories, shared symbols. They have complicated lives. There's division of labour. There are gendered tasks, age-graded roles, probably elders who mediate disputes and keep histories in their heads. There are rituals we can only glimpse from residue and bones and painted walls. And all of this exists tens of thousands of years before the first farm, long before anyone stacks bricks into a city wall. Then the climate moves again. About 11,700 years ago, the last big ice age lets go, and the Holocene begins, the relatively stable warm period we're still in. Forests and grasslands spread, glaciers retreat, sea levels climb. For human groups, the world gets both easier and more crowded. This is when the story most people know from school begins to stir. The shift from mobile hunting and gathering toward more settled, food-producing ways of life. But that shift is not a single invention. It's not one genius saying, "Behold agriculture." It's a patchwork of gradual transitions repeated in many places with local twists. In the Near East, in what's sometimes called the Fertile Crescent, you start to see something called sedentism, people staying in one place for much of the year. Villages of round or rectangular houses, trash piles growing in the same spots for centuries. These aren't cities yet, they're extended neighbourhoods. But they mark a psychological turn. Home becomes a fixed point, not just a camp you abandon when the seasons change. At the same time, people begin tinkering with plants and animals. First, they're just managing wild stands of grain, cutting at the right time, maybe encouraging regrowth. Then, over generations, they start selecting seeds from plants that don't shatter in the wind, that bear more grain, that tolerate being crowded. No one writes down a breeding program. They just keep favouring what works. Slowly, wheat and barley stop looking like their wild cousins. Animals follow a similar path. People capture wild sheep, goats, pigs, cattle. At first, they're just living larders, meat on the hoof. But over time, herds are managed, culled, steered. Skulls and bones change shape. Horns shrink or bend. You're looking at domestication as a long conversation between humans and other species, not a single deal struck on a particular day. What emerges out of these experiments In region after region, Southwest Asia, China, the Americas, later Africa and Europe, is a gradient. At one end, fully mobile hunter-gatherers. At the other, farmers tied to fields. In the middle, for thousands of years, are people who are both. They plant here, hunt there, fish over there, move seasonally, build semi-permanent houses, come back to the same ritual sites year after year. And those ritual sites become the next big surprise on the timeline. Before anyone builds what we'd comfortably call a city, you get what some archaeologists call pre-urban complexity, monumental gathering places in landscapes that still look, on paper, like they're inhabited by small, simple societies. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey is the poster child. Massive stone pillars, some over 5 meters tall, arranged in circles, carved with animals and abstract symbols, built around 11,000 years ago by people who, as far as we can tell, were still hunting, gathering, and doing only the earliest kinds of plant management. No pottery, no city grid, but a construction project that required planning, engineering, logistics, and enough surplus food to keep workers on site. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone in concept, even if it's unique in scale. Across Europe, there are earlier ritual landscapes made of earth and timber, causewayed enclosures, earthen circles, alignments. In the Americas, you have mound complexes at places like Watson Break and Poverty Point, predating or overlapping with full agriculture. In the Near East, there are clusters of sites with special buildings, plastered skulls, elaborate burials set apart from ordinary houses. The pattern is odd but persistent. In many regions, large ritual or ceremonial constructions appear before anything that looks like concentrated urban residence. In other words, people organize huge collective efforts for symbolic or religious reasons before they do it for politics or commerce. Temples, in a loose sense, come before cities. Eventually, though, cities do appear, and they don't just pop up randomly on the map. The earliest dense urban settlements and bureaucratic states show up in a handful of river-fed regions. Southern Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile Valley, the Indus River Basin, the Yellow River Plain. Places with fertile soils, reliable water, and the ability to support irrigation. By around 6,000 to 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, you start to see towns that grow into true cities. Thousands, then tens of thousands of people packed into a few square kilometers. Houses elbowing each other, workshops, temples, storage facilities, defensive walls. Alongside the architecture, you get something new in the trash. Clay tablets with little impressions. Tokens and marks turning into proto-writing, then full writing, because someone has to keep track of grain, labour, taxes, offerings. Bureaucracy is not glamorous, but it leaves very clear fingerprints. Standardized weights and measures, seals to mark ownership. Repeated tablet formats for recording rations, shipments, legal decisions. Once those appear, you're firmly in the world of states, institutions that can command labour at scale, maintain standing hierarchies, and project power beyond a single village. Why there, and not everywhere at once? The mainstream view points to a combination of factors. Productive rivers that can be channeled but only with coordinated labour. Surpluses that can be skimmed off to support specialists. Priests, scribes, soldiers, artisans. Trade crossroads where controlling a hub means controlling the flow of valuable goods. And always local histories, earlier villages, shrines, and networks that provide the scaffolding for something bigger. That's the part of the timeline mainstream archaeology feels relatively confident about. The broad sweep from mobile foragers with art and long-distance exchange to semi-sedentary communities experimenting with cultivation and herding, to ritual landscapes, to the first cities with writing and administration. What's still debated are the details, the tempos, the exceptions. Did complex social organization require farming, or can very sophisticated hunter-gatherers build big monuments and manage wide territories without crops? Sites like Göbekli Tepe and some North American mound complexes keep that question alive. Were cities inevitable once agriculture began? Or are they rare, contingent accidents that only happen when multiple conditions line up? Scholars argue about that too. How many times did urban-like complexity start up, and then stall or transform into something that doesn't leave familiar kinds of ruins? How many episodes of dense, seasonally occupied centres have been mistaken for simple villages because the record is thin? Even within the mainstream, the timeline is full of these open doors and shaded areas. The big milestones, art, exchange, sedentism, domestication, monuments, cities, are reasonably clear. The paths between them are tangled, and that's where the question of resets sneaks in. If this is what we can see, even through erosion and rising seas and missing archives, what would it take to hide an entire cycle of complexity before all of this? To imagine that, we have to look not just at the steps on the ladder, but at the climate and catastrophes that kept kicking the ladder around. If you zoom out from the village and the city and look at the backdrop, you notice something unnerving. The ground under all of these stories is not stable. It breathes. Over the last couple of million years, Earth has been cycling in and out of ice ages with a kind of slow, ruthless rhythm. Ice sheets grow for tens of thousands of years, then shrink back. Sea levels fall by more than 100 meters, then rise again. Forests march south, then retreat north. Deserts bloom, then die. On paper, these glacial cycles are driven by tiny changes in Earth's orbit and tilt. Milankovitch cycles, the astronomy textbooks call them. In practice, they feel less like smooth sine waves and more like a staircase with some broken steps. Long, cold builds, shorter, sudden warm snaps, teeth on a saw. On human timescales, what matters is not the full 100,000-year loop, but the parts where the line bends sharply. When an ice sheet grows, it locks up water. Global sea level drops. If you were living 20,000 years ago, your world map would look very different. Coastlines march outward. Continental shelves that are now underwater are dry land. Often the best land, broad, flat, fertile plains threaded by rivers. When the ice retreats, the reverse happens. Water pours back into the oceans. Shorelines drown. A village that sat a pleasant walk from the beach becomes a reef. A trading route along a coastal plain turns into a chain of islands or disappears completely beneath the waves. From our perspective, reading maps in an atlas, these look like big but slow changes. From the perspective of a community that uses a particular bay for fishing or a low river valley for farming, they can feel brutally fast. A metre of sea level rise in a lifetime is quite enough to ruin your harbour, flood your fields, salt your wells. Layered on top of that long rise and fall are the climate jolts. The last ice age was not a single uniform deep freeze. It was punctuated by abrupt climate events, Dansgaard-Eschger events in the jargon, in which large parts of the North Atlantic region seem to have warmed or cooled dramatically in just decades. Greenland ice cores show temperature shifts of 5, 8, even 10 degrees Celsius over very short intervals. For the people on the ground, that doesn't mean checking a thermometer. It means the animals you hunt change their migration routes. The plants you rely on flower earlier, or fail to set seed at all. A place that supported a band for generations suddenly can't. Or, just as suddenly, an area that was marginal becomes rich. These jolts redirect rivers of people. They push groups into new territories, compressing populations together, producing conflict in some regions, new alliances in others. They can cut off trade routes for a century and then reopen them. They can trap a group in a refuge, as happened during that immense bottleneck almost 1 million years ago, or fling them outward in waves. It's tempting to turn climate into a universal eraser, to say a big enough cold snap, a big enough drought, a big enough storm, and everything must vanish. No cities, no monuments, no memory, but climate stress doesn't automatically wipe the slate clean. Those bottleneck survivors we met earlier lived through climate chaos, incomparably worse than anything in the last 100,000 years. They did not have stone walls, irrigation canals, or storage jars. What they had was flexibility. Small, mobile groups, social networks that stretched across landscapes, the ability to abandon a failing area and try somewhere else. Even later, when people are building monuments and experimenting with sedentary life, you see that same pattern. During the coldest phases of the last ice age, there are still rich sites, Aurignacian, Gravettian, Magdalenian in Europe, full of elaborate tools, art and long-distance exchange. Climate squeezes, but people adapt. They cluster along refuges, rivers, coasts and ice-free corridors. Some traditions end, others intensify. A regional drought might collapse a river-based kingdom while leaving mountain herders relatively untouched. A cooling swing might devastate crops in one latitude and extend growing seasons in another. Climate is a powerful editor, but it edits unevenly. Our picture of this restless background doesn't come from guesswork. It comes from a kind of forensic science layered on top of itself. In Greenland and Antarctica, ice builds up year after year, trapping bubbles of ancient air and layers of dust. Drill a core and you're holding a frozen time series. Ratios of oxygen and hydrogen isotopes in the ice tell you about past temperatures. Tiny trapped gases reveal greenhouse levels. Volcanic ash layers mark eruptions, sometimes to the exact year. In lakes and bogs, mud accumulates in thin annual laminations. Mixed into those layers are grains of pollen and spores. Different plants shed different shapes. Under a microscope you can watch forests invade, grasslands retreat, wetlands dry out. You can see, for example, when oak gives way to pine, or when cereal pollen appears near a settlement, hinting at local agriculture. Ocean sediments add another archive, shells of microscopic plankton, whose chemistry reflects sea temperatures and ice volume. Desert dust, blown thousands of kilometers, settles onto the seafloor and into ice, tracing shifts in wind and aridity. Tree rings tighten or widen with each good or bad growth year, sometimes locking in evidence of single-season droughts or frosts. Cave stalagmites grow in slow mineral drips, preserving isotopic records of rainfall over tens of thousands of years. Put all of these together, ice cores, pollen, sediments, tree rings, speleothems, and you start to see a coherent pattern of past climates. It's not perfect. There are gaps and disagreements. One core might suggest a sharp, sudden event. Another, further away, shows a more muted response. Local conditions can blur the global picture. And this is where interpretation becomes slippery and important. When you line up a climate curve with an archaeological timeline, this drought here, that cultural shift there, it's easy to draw straight arrows. Climate crisis causes collapse, warming causes expansion, cooling snuffs out complexity. Sometimes the fit is genuinely tight. The end of the African humid period, for example, seems closely linked to changes in Nile floods and the fortunes of early Egyptian states. The so-called 4.2 kiloyear event, a cluster of arid episodes, appears in inscriptions lamenting failed rains from Mesopotamia to the Levant. Sometimes the match is fuzzier. A society transforms over centuries while the climate wobbles in the background. Was rainfall the driver, or just one more factor mixed with politics, trade, disease, invention? Because our climate records have different resolutions, some annual, some smeared over centuries, small, fast disasters can hide inside broad trends. A 3-year super drought that wrecked a marginal kingdom might leave only a faint signal in a lake core. A series of freak storms could erase a port town without changing regional precipitation, averages much at all. So when people ask whether there might have been earlier civilizations erased by ice ages, they're really asking how ruthless this climate editor can be and how much noise it adds to the archaeological record. To push that question further, we have to follow one particular consequence of the ice, the way it moved the shorelines that most humans probably preferred to live along, that takes us from glaciers and pollen straight into the drowned world at the edge of the continents. When you look at a modern map, it's easy to forget that the blue and the green have traded territory many times. For most of the last ice age, global sea level was 60, 80, 100 meters lower than it is now. Whole continents had fattened edges. What we see today as narrow coastal strips were, back then, broad plains stretching far out from the present shoreline. And if you were a human trying to make a living without fossil fuels, those plains were prime real estate. Coasts concentrate gifts, rivers bring nutrients and sediment from inland, building deltas and estuaries rich in plant and animal life. Tides and currents stir everything, so waters stay oxygenated and productive. You get shellfish in the shallows, fish running predictable routes, seabirds nesting on cliffs, seals and other marine mammals on beaches, plus all the bounty of nearby forests and grassland. On land, inland environments can be feast or famine. One valley rich, the next barren. The coast smooths some of that out. You can rotate strategies: shellfish when big game is scarce, fish when the shellfish beds are over-harvested, wild grains and roots from the hinterland in season. Food is literally layered in zones from the high tide line to the inland ridges. Coasts are also corridors. Walk along a shoreline and you can, in principle, go thousands of kilometers without crossing a single mountain range. Bays and inlets become natural harbors for boats. Even before real seafaring, people could move rafts, dugout canoes, or skin boats from cove to cove, carrying obsidian, shells, stories, spouses. Mild climates are part of the appeal. Water moderates temperature. Winter on the coast is usually less brutal than winter inland at the same latitude. Frosts are softer, growing seasons a bit longer. For early farmers, that matters. For foragers sleeping under animal skins, it matters even more. When you put all of that together, it's not surprising that some archaeologists argue a lot of early human migrations followed coasts. Beachcomber routes skirting the shores of the Indian Ocean, or moving along the Pacific edge of the Americas. But there's a catch. The best Pleistocene coasts are mostly gone. As the last ice age ended between about 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, sea levels rose on average more than 100 meters. That didn't happen in a smooth slide. There were pulses, centuries, when meltwater from collapsing ice sheets poured into the oceans so fast that shorelines could jump tens of meters in a human lifetime. Every time the line crept inland, it erased something. Campsites, fishing spots, simple seasonal hamlets. Maybe later, villages with fields just behind the dunes. If any early experiments with more settled, complex life were being tried out on those broad Ice Age coastal plains, the water had hundreds of kilometers of horizontal distance over which to erase them. The archaeological problem is obvious. Most of our excavations are on land we can easily reach, ploughed fields, eroded hillsides, caves, river terraces. We reconstruct past lifeways from those, then project toward the sea as though the present coastline is a fixed boundary. But the people we're studying may have done the opposite. They may have treated the shoreline as the spine of their world, with inland sites as occasional forays. Underwater archaeology tries to correct for this, but the ocean is a difficult archive. In shallow shelves near modern coasts, sonar mapping can pick up old river channels, ancient shorelines, submerged dunes. Divers and remotely operated vehicles can investigate specific targets like drowned caves or Stone Age quarries. A few spectacular finds have turned up this way. Submerged Mesolithic sites in the North Sea's Doggerland, Neolithic villages under the Black Sea, Paleolithic tools off the coast of India and Israel. These show that, yes, people were living where dry land has since drowned. They had hearths, post holes, storage pits, sometimes even preserved wooden structures. But scaling that up is hard. The sea floor is vast. Much of it is covered in thick blankets of sediment that hide whatever was there. Storms and currents rearrange sand and mud, disturbing layers that on land might sit quietly for millennia. Salt water destroys wood, leather, textiles and bone far more efficiently than dry caves or deserts do. Sonar and sub-bottom profilers can hint at buried landscapes, an old river valley here, a beach ridge there, but they don't automatically tell you where a small human camp was. Even if you spot something promising, sending teams down, recovering artifacts gently, and then interpreting them in context is expensive and slow. So it is entirely plausible that some missing chapters of human history are sitting on continental shelves, unexcavated and maybe unexcavatable. Generations who lived and died on now drowned plains. Networks of coastal foragers and fishers who carried ideas and genes along shorelines we can no longer walk. This does not require lost global empires with steel and satellites. All it takes is what we already know existed on land. Small communities, regional trade, slowly accumulating craft traditions. A string of villages along a drowned delta can vanish from direct sight, while still being very ordinary in technological terms, stone tools, wooden houses, maybe early fields, boats caulked with pitch. If such coastal societies were simple fishing camps, they might leave almost nothing we can detect now. A scatter of stone flakes, some hearths, organic remains long since dissolved. If they were more settled, building with stone or digging deep storage pits, we have a better chance. Stone is stubborn, a line of large foundation blocks, a rock-walled well, a causeway built of piled cobbles. Those can survive submergence. So can dense shell middens, literal hills of discarded shells and bones that sometimes persist as strange mounds on the modern seafloor. Cut marks on submerged bones, artificial channels in drowned marshes, pollen signatures of human-managed plants trapped in mud. These are the quiet fingerprints we look for. We have found some of them, enough to prove that the drowned world was inhabited, not just an empty blank waiting for the sea. Not yet enough to map it at anything like the resolution we have for inland valleys and caves. So, when people imagine earlier civilizations washed away by rising seas, there is a kernel of reasonable doubt there. Not about skyscrapers and satellites under the waves, but about more modest coastal lifeways that we have only begun to sample. To understand what those might have looked like, and how fragile their memories can be, we have to widen the lens from water alone to the full spectrum of disaster, the quakes, eruptions, plagues and storms that leave sometimes sharp, sometimes barely visible, scars in the deep past. When people talk about catastrophes, they often imagine a single giant event that wipes the slate clean. One day everything is fine, the next it's ash and silence. Reality is messier. The planet is constantly throwing dice. Earthquakes, eruptions, droughts, plagues, tsunamis, storms. Most are local or regional, A few are big enough to dim the sun. Each type leaves its own kind of scar, and some scars fossilize better than others. Start with earthquakes. On human timescales, they can feel apocalyptic. Cities flattened in minutes, hillsides collapsing, rivers shifted, tsunamis racing across bays. But geologically, an earthquake is mostly a nudge. Rock layers crack and offset. Coastlines rise a metre here, drop a metre there. The record it leaves is subtle. A displaced sediment layer, a buried soil horizon, a drowned forest where tree trunks suddenly end under mud. In written history, we can match those with chronicles of shaking and ruin. In prehistory, without diaries, an earthquake is often just a kink in the stratigraphy that a specialist has to squint at. For human societies, the damage is front-loaded and very visible, but the memory is fragile. Wooden houses rot, mud brick walls slump and weather away. A stone temple toppled by an earthquake and rebuilt on the same spot might, thousands of years later, look no different from a temple that was simply renovated, because a king wanted a nicer courtyard. So major quakes can absolutely shatter a region. They just don't always shout clearly from the deep past. Their footprint is often negative evidence, abandoned fault-zone settlements, new towns built slightly farther from the dangerous cliff, a pattern of sudden architectural change we can only guess at. Volcanoes are different. Volcanoes like to leave signatures. A big eruption doesn't just destroy things nearby. It throws material high into the atmosphere. Ash falls over enormous areas. Tiny glass shards drift down into lakes, bogs, ice sheets. Those shards can be dated and chemically fingerprinted. A layer of ash a few centimeters thick in a Greenland ice core can be matched to the same ash in a Japanese lake bed and traced back to a particular mountain. That's why we know about super eruptions like Toba around 74,000 years ago, or more modest but still enormous events like the eruption of Thera in the Bronze Age or Tambora in 1815. And some eruptions don't just make ash, they make winters. If enough sulfur gets blasted into the stratosphere, it forms particles that reflect sunlight. Temperatures drop, harvests fail. In historical times, we see this as a cluster of bad years: frost in summer, food shortages, reports of dry fog and dim suns. Tree rings narrow across entire continents. Grain prices spike. People riot and migrate. Tambora's eruption turned 1816 into the year without a summer in parts of Europe and North America. Crops failed, famines and epidemics followed. We can see that in written sources, but if you erase the documents and left only the physical traces, what would remain? A layer of ash in some places, a sulfur spike in polar ice. Tree rings stunted for a year or two, mass graves in some regions, settlement shrinkage, a cold blip in climate reconstructions. Scale that back into prehistory and you can see the difficulty. Volcanic winters can hit food systems hard enough to cause migrations, demographic crashes, even cultural breaks. But unless the eruption was truly enormous or very well sampled in our cores and sediments, it might look like just another short cold pulse in a long noisy climate record. Disease is trickier still. Plague doesn't move rock. It doesn't scatter ash. It moves through bodies and households, and it kills selectively. Some people die, some live and carry immunity onto their children. Its footprints are human: crowded burial grounds, hurried mass graves, cemeteries where age profiles suddenly skew toward young adults rather than infants, and the very old. In the last couple of decades, ancient DNA has added another layer. Researchers extract fragments of pathogen DNA from teeth and bones. That's how we confirmed that the Black Death in medieval Europe really was caused by Yersinia pestis, and how we've begun to track older waves of plague back into the Bronze Age. Demographically, a big epidemic can hollow a region out. Fields go untended. Villages contract or are abandoned. Trade networks fray because there simply aren't enough people to maintain them. On a map of archaeological sites, you see fewer dots or smaller ones in the centuries after a pandemic. But again, from a distance, the signal blurs. 100 possible causes can make settlements shrink or disappear. War, drought, soil exhaustion, political collapse. Disease might be the trigger, or just one ingredient in a stew of problems. Without texts, without genetic samples, we often can't say which. And then there's the problem of synchrony. From the vantage point of one valley, a devastating earthquake might feel like the end of the world. From the perspective of the whole planet, it might barely register. The same is true of plagues and eruptions. A pandemic like the Justinian plague in late antiquity hammered the Mediterranean and parts of Europe and the Near East, but left other continents untouched. Tambora darkened skies worldwide, but its most severe social effects were regionally uneven. Ancient people didn't have satellite maps. If every town you trade with falls silent, if the horizon is hazy and the crops fail, and strangers bring new fevers, it can feel like everything is ending everywhere. Stories that grow out of that experience tend to scale the disaster up. Myths of the whole world darkening, all people dying, everyone flooded can arise from what, geologically speaking, was a patchy, uneven crisis. Meanwhile, when we look back with our partial records, we can fall into the opposite trap, mistaking a regional pattern for a global one. A run of climate proxies from one hemisphere, a cluster of abandoned sites in one cultural zone, can tempt us into thinking in world reset terms when, on another continent, life went on with smaller ripples. Where things get especially interesting for reset stories is when catastrophes stack. Imagine a region that has already been stressed by decades of erratic rainfall and poor harvests. The soil is tired, political tensions are high, then a big eruption throws in 2 cold summers. Crops fail again, malnutrition spreads. A new disease arrives on top of that, moving faster and killing more because people are weakened. In the chaos, warfare escalates. Trade routes are cut. Skilled artisans die. Administrations can't pay or feed their own staff. None of these blows is quite enough to wipe everyone out. But together, over a generation or two, they can break complex systems. Writing stops, not because ink was outlawed, but because scribes have no employers. Monument building halts, not because stone ran out, but because there is no surplus agricultural labour to move it. People retreat from cities to smaller, more defensible villages. They simplify technologies to what they can maintain locally. They forget how to quarry stone a certain way, how to calculate a long-term calendar, how to rig a particular kind of ship. To later generations living in that aftermath, the past can look impossibly grand and distant. Tales of the ancients with their great buildings and far-travelling ships start to sound like legends. A span of a few hundred years with fewer records can turn into the Dark Age, a blurry gap between before and now. From our perspective, with satellite imagery and radiocarbon dates and ice cores, we can often see that these are not true resets. They are partial collapses, regional downturns, messy reconfigurations. Human populations shrunken, not erased, cultures transformed, not annihilated. But to people on the ground, enduring compound shocks, it could feel like the end of a world. That feeling matters, because it's the soil in which reset myths grow. And it's why when we hear stories about a time when everything was destroyed or the gods remade the earth, we have to ask a careful question. Are we hearing about a single blow or about a long tangled knot of disasters that blurred together in memory? To tease those apart, we'll look at one of the sharpest climate jolts in recent prehistory, an abrupt chill at the end of the last ice age that has become a magnet for reset theories, the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas sits in the climate record like a hard stop. You're coming out of the last glacial maximum. Ice sheets are retreating. Temperatures are climbing. Lakes are filling. Plants are moving north. Animals are following. For thousands of years the trend is clear. The world is thawing. Then, almost abruptly, it isn't. Around 12,900 years ago, in many proxies from the northern hemisphere, temperatures drop back toward full ice age conditions. Not quite all the way, and not everywhere equally, but enough that in Greenland ice cores the shift looks like falling off a step. You see it in the ratios of oxygen isotopes that track temperature. You see it in the dust. You see it in the way pollen records change, forests retreating, cold-loving plants returning. Then, about 1,200 years later, just as sharply, it ends. Temperatures shoot back up. The Holocene, our current warm interval, really begins. If you're looking for a reset button in the late Pleistocene, it's hard not to stare at that. What caused it is still debated, and that's where the temptation of a single dramatic event comes in. The most widely discussed family of explanations involves water and currents, not fire from the sky. As the ice sheets melted, enormous lakes of glacial meltwater pooled along their margins. One of these, often called Lake Agassiz, sat where central Canada is now. If a huge volume of that cold, fresh water suddenly drained into the North Atlantic, it could have disrupted the ocean conveyor system that moves heat around the planet, shut down or weaken that circulation, and the North Atlantic region cools rapidly, even while the global average might not change as dramatically. This idea fits some lines of evidence well. There are signs of big meltwater outbursts in North American geology. The timing roughly matches the start of the Younger Dryas. Climate models show that dumping enough fresh water into the right spot could produce the kind of pattern we see. Sharp cooling in the north, smaller or opposite shifts elsewhere. But fits pretty well isn't the same as settled. Other researchers emphasize changes in atmospheric circulation or in the way ice sheets themselves responded to background warming. Some suggest the system was already wobbling, and relatively modest nudges pushed it over a threshold. Climate, especially near the end of an ice age, is touchy. You don't always need one gigantic cause, you need enough feedback loops lined up in the same direction. Into that uncertainty steps a more dramatic proposal, the impact hypothesis. According to this idea, a comet or fragmented body exploded over or impacted parts of North America around 12,900 years ago, starting wildfires, kicking dust into the atmosphere, and plunging the climate back into cold conditions. Proponents point to layers of sediment with unusual features, tiny spherules of melted material, elevated levels of certain elements, microscopic diamonds that can form under high pressures and temperatures. They also note that this timing coincides with significant changes in North American megafauna and with a decline of the Clovis hunting tradition. On paper, it's an appealing story. One sky event, one sharp cooling, one apparent turnover in animals and tools. Connect the dots, and you have a ready-made cataclysm to hang reset narratives on. The problem is that the dots don't line up cleanly. Some of the claimed impact markers appear inconsistent between sites, or can be produced by more ordinary processes like wildfires and human activity. Other teams have gone back to the same layers and not found the same signatures. The archaeological timing of megafaunal extinctions and cultural change looks more staggered and regionally varied the closer you examine it. Many paleontologists see a longer decline in big animals tied to habitat shifts and human hunting pressure, not a single sudden die-off. Most importantly, if a truly large impact or airburst had triggered a hemisphere-scale climate reversal, we might expect stronger, clearer global signs. a distinct layer of impact debris found widely, like at the end Cretaceous dinosaur killing event. So far, that kind of unambiguous, planet-wide impact fingerprint hasn't shown up for the younger Dryas. That doesn't mean no cosmic event happened. Small airbursts occur. Tunguska in 1908 is one historical example. It does mean that, at present, the impact hypothesis is not the majority view among climate scientists, and its evidence is more contested than many popular treatments suggest. Where the impact enthusiasts have a point is in the basic intuition, an abrupt return to colder, drier conditions at the very moment humans are spreading into new lands and experimenting with new ways of living would have been disruptive. Whether the trigger was meltwater, winds, ice dynamics, or something exploding overhead, the effect on people on the ground would be similar. Familiar patterns of rain and growth suddenly betray you. Imagine you're part of a group that has been following retreating ice edges into newly available valleys, or tending wild stands of cereals that have become increasingly reliable year after year. Then the climate flips, winters lengthen, summers become shorter, more erratic. Plants fail in places that had been dependable. Herds shift their ranges. Wetlands that once held fish and reeds freeze more deeply or dry at the wrong time. Archaeologists working in the Near East see something like this in the layers that span the younger Dryas. The Natufian culture, which had built relatively permanent villages and was intensifying its use of wild grains, faces a more arid, less predictable Levant. Some communities seem to shrink or move, others double down on gathering and mobility. The process toward farming doesn't stop, but it zigzags. Elsewhere, in Europe and North America, settlement patterns suggest adjustments in where people camped, what they hunted, which routes they travelled. From our perspective, these are subtle shifts in radiocarbon dates and tool styles. From theirs, they were choices made under pressure. Stay or go, specialise or diversify, cling to a valley that's failing or follow the herds into riskier terrain. If there had been an especially rapid disruption woven into this cooling, whether from an impact, a huge flood of meltwater, or a sudden reorganisation of winds, what would we expect to see in the archaeological record? Probably not a neat global scar, but a mosaic of local breaks. You would look for sites where one way of life persists for centuries and then, within a short span, disappears or is replaced by a very different pattern. You'd see abandoned villages with no obvious signs of warfare. You'd see shifts in diet, preserved in bones and residues, fewer big animals, more small game and plants, or vice versa. You'd see changes in toolkits that suggest people are reorganizing their economies, more gear for mobility, or for processing poorer, tougher foods. You might notice gaps in occupation in marginal areas, with people retreating to refuges where water and resources were still stable. Trade in distant stone or shell could falter, then reappear along new routes better aligned with the changed climate. We do see many of these things around the younger Dryas, but they aren't synchronized like a single bell tolling across the globe. They lurch and shift in different regions at slightly different times, superimposed on longer trends that began before the cold snap and continued after. Which brings us back to the larger theme. The younger Dryas shows how quickly climate can pivot, how sensitive human lifeways are to those pivots, and how easy it is for us and for ancient storytellers to imagine that such a pivot must have had one dramatic cause, one impact, one night of fire, one flood. The evidence so far suggests something more complex. Powerful, yes, but tangled, spread out in time and space, modulated by local geography and human response. For people living through it, though, that distinction might not have mattered. Their memories would hold on to the feeling. The world was warming, and then it betrayed us. We had to move. We had to change. Some things were lost and never came back. Those are the raw materials myths work with. And when we turn from climate graphs and sediment cores to stories about waters rising and worlds drowned, those raw materials start to look very familiar. If you open a mythology book to almost any page, it can start to feel like the planet is obsessed with drowning people. Mesopotamia has Utnapishtim and a God-sent deluge. The Hebrew Bible has Noah. India has Manu and a talking fish warning of rising waters. Greece has Deucalion and Pyrrha, bobbing in a chest on a flooded world. China has Gun and Yu wrestling with unmanageable waters. Many indigenous traditions in the Americas and Australia tell of canoes tied to mountain tops, of animals struggling to find a place where land still exists. It's tempting to see all of these as echoes of one single world-ending flood. One geological event scattered into dozens of cultural mirrors. But before we jump to that, it helps to ask a quieter question. How much flooding does an ordinary human lifetime actually contain? If you live by a river that feeds you, it will flood. Not once, often. Monsoon seasons shift a little. Snowmelt comes fast one year. A storm stalls and drops more water than anyone remembers. The river jumps its banks, surges through fields, takes houses and people and animals. Maybe it doesn't recede in days the way it normally does. Maybe it cuts a new channel and never goes back. If you live on a coast, storms push the sea inland. A tropical cyclone combines wind, low pressure and tide, and water climbs streets that have never seen it before. If you live on low islands or deltas, even a modest rise in sea level over a few generations can turn familiar ground into salt marsh, then into open water. You don't need a global ocean catastrophe for floods to feel apocalyptic. You just need them to hit where people build their lives. That's one reason flood myths are so common. They sit at the crossroads of where humans like to settle: rivers, fertile floodplains, deltas, coasts, and the hazards built into those choices. Add human psychology, which is very good at remembering the times when everything went wrong, and you get stories that cling. Now add time. Oral traditions don't store events like a calendar. They compress. Take a bad year or a bad decade. Crops fail. Rivers misbehave. Storms come in strange seasons. Elders tell children what happened. They emphasize the parts that matter, the warnings that were ignored, the signs that preceded disaster, the behaviors that saved a few. The next generation inherits the story, but not the details. They inherit a pattern. A horizon turns black. The river rises beyond the old stones. The sea does something it has never done before. The people who listen and change their behavior live. The people who don't. Over centuries, these compressed patterns harden into archetypes. A great flood becomes the story you reach for whenever water threatens. The dimensions of the boat, the names of the gods, the mountain where the survivors land, those shift with culture and landscape. The structure stays. This is why similar motifs can appear in cultures that never met. You don't need Mesopotamian sailors teaching South American communities about Noah for both to develop stories where a handful survive in a boat or on a high place. You just need rivers, storms, and people trying to make sense of why some live and others don't. At the same time, cultural diffusion is real. Ideas travel with traders and migrants as easily as obsidian and shells. The Near Eastern and Mediterranean flood stories, for example, show signs of borrowing and reshaping. Earlier Mesopotamian tales feed into later Hebrew traditions. Greek versions may have drawn on Eastern motifs. Here, the similarities go beyond lots of water and into specific narrative beats: a favoured individual warned in advance, animals preserved, a vessel resting on a named mountain, a post-flood sacrifice. So when we see flood myths everywhere, we're looking at a mixture. independent invention that springs from shared human situations and chains of influence where stories and symbols are passed along and reworked. Inside those stories, certain things are surprisingly durable. Place names can be preserved for a very long time. A myth might speak of the hill that stayed dry, or the bay that swallowed the village. Even after languages shift, those names can linger in the landscape, sometimes pointing archaeologists toward old shorelines or ancient settlements. Myths also carry moral lessons. Don't cut the sacred forest. Don't build where the elders say the water once came. Don't ignore warnings from animals or strange weather. To us, these are narrative flourishes. To the people who first told them, they were encoded behavioral rules, ecological hints, wrapped in story. Some flood traditions also contain oddly specific environmental details, the kind of foam on the advancing water, the way certain birds reacted, the pattern of debris left behind. In a few cases, such details have lined up suggestively with geological reconstructions of tsunamis or storm surges. Not as proof, but as a nudge. Maybe something happened here that left marks in both rock and memory. Still, using myth as a map to past events is a delicate business. If we treat every story as literal geology, every deluge as a global ocean rise, every mountaintop boat as a physical arc, we quickly leave evidence behind and drift into wishful thinking. Myths are not seismographs, but if we ignore them entirely because they aren't precise, we lose access to a different kind of record. How people perceived and responded to upheaval, what patterns they thought worth telling their grandchildren about, which places they marked as dangerous or sacred because of what had happened there long before. The careful path lies in between. We can lay stories alongside sediment cores and old shorelines, not to force them to match, but to let each suggest questions for the other. Does a tale of land lost to the sea coincide with a known gradual Holocene sea level rise along that coast? Does a local memory of the day the ocean ran uphill echo the signature of a tsunami in coastal deposits? Sometimes the answer is yes. Often it's maybe. Sometimes it's no. In all cases, the myths are doing what they were shaped to do, turning scattered, frightening events into patterns that humans can think about, teach, and live with. And when we're tempted to imagine that one single flood reset the world and birthed all civilization anew, it's worth remembering that from the ground, many smaller floods spread across centuries can feel just as final, especially if you're one of the ones who doesn't make it to the boat. From here, the question shifts again. If floods and storms and slow sea level rise can push people to higher ground and new habits, what do we see when we look at the first big monuments that appear on those high places, long before cities and farms are supposed to exist? When archaeologists first started digging at Göbekli Tepe, on a dry hill in southeastern Turkey, they thought they knew the script. Big stone monuments are supposed to come late in the story. First you get villages, then fields of grain and herds of animals, then surplus food, then specialists who don't have to farm, and finally enough spare labour and hierarchy to drag stones around for temples and palaces. Göbekli Tepe did not read the memo. Under that dusty mound were circular enclosures, T-shaped stone pillars weighing many tons, carved with foxes, snakes, wild boar, vultures, abstract symbols. The site goes back to around 11,500 years ago, maybe earlier, before pottery in that region, before clear evidence of settled farming, when people were still, by most definitions, hunter-gatherers. And yet here was something that looked a lot like a shrine complex. What makes a place like this so unsettling, in a good way, is not just the stones themselves, but what they imply about the people who raised them. You don't move multi-ton pillars uphill and stand them in prepared sockets with a casual afternoon's effort. You need planning, quarrying stone from somewhere else, shaping it, transporting it, coordinating times and tasks. You need a shared idea of what the structure is supposed to be when it's finished, where each pillar goes, how high, how the space will be arranged. You also need labour, not 2 or 3 people, likely dozens at a time, maybe more depending on how you think the work was organised. That means some kind of social mechanism to gather people, kinship ties, ritual obligations, promises of feasts, maybe emerging leaders who can persuade or pressure others. And once you've built it, you need meaning. Those pillars are not just supports. They're stylized bodies, broad shoulders, hands carved along the sides, belts and loincloths indicated by reliefs. The animals and symbols on them don't look like random decoration. They suggest a shared symbolic world, maybe stories or cosmologies we can only glimpse. This combination, labour, planning, symbolism, is why early monumental sites matter for understanding social organisation. They are the fossilised footprints of coordinated communities. There's an ongoing debate about what exactly Göbekli Tepe was. One reading sees it as a ritual centre used seasonally by scattered groups. People who normally lived in smaller bands might converge on this hill for certain times of year, to perform ceremonies, to renew alliances, to find marriage partners, to feast. Archaeological traces support this to some extent. There's evidence of large-scale consumption of wild animals, and possibly of feasting on a scale beyond everyday meals. Some researchers suggest that the effort of building and maintaining such a place could have been bound up with these gatherings, work and ritual feeding into each other. Then there's the question of food production itself. Around the same general period, we see early signs of cultivation in that broader region. Wild cereals being tended, fields being burned or weeded, the first steps along the path toward domesticated wheat and barley. Some scholars argue that gathering people for monumental projects and feasts may have pushed communities toward more reliable food sources. If you want to host big gatherings regularly, knowing you'll have enough grain and meat becomes important. Others flip the causality, perhaps increasingly sedentary. Cultivation experimenting groups built monuments as an expression of their new ties to place and to each other. The dating and sequence are still being refined. Layers at Göbekli Tepe and nearby sites suggest complex overlaps between foraging, tending wild stands of plants, hunting, and maybe early herding. The neat line from pure hunter-gatherer to settled farmer to monument builder starts to blur. In that blur, some people see an opening for much grander stories. Massive stones, intricate carvings, mysterious symbols, very early date that can sound at first blush like evidence of a lost high technology or a forgotten civilization operating at a level beyond what simple foragers could manage. But if we look closely at what's actually there, the picture is impressive without needing anything exotic. Stone carving and moving heavy objects are skills that don't require metals, wheels, or advanced machines. They require time, knowledge of stone, ropes, levers, wooden sledges, cooperative effort, and the willingness to invest energy in something that isn't immediately about survival. We know from later ethnographic cases that societies without agriculture or writing can orchestrate surprisingly large projects. Pacific Island communities have moved and erected big stone figures. North American groups built extensive earthworks. None of this demanded electricity or lost physics, just social organization, tradition, and motivation. Göbekli Tepe fits into that broader human capacity. It stretches our assumptions about when such coordination is possible, not the laws of nature. What it really reshapes is our mental timeline of who could build what and when. Instead of imagining that complicated ritual architecture appears only after cities and kings, we now have solid evidence that mobile or semi-sedentary groups could pool labour for ambitious, symbol-laden spaces. Instead of seeing religion, art and large-scale cooperation as luxuries emerging from surplus, We can entertain the idea that shared beliefs and gatherings were among the engines that helped create surplus, and eventually agriculture and permanent settlements. In other words, the road to civilization may run not just through fields and storage jars, but through hills where people came together to carve their stories into stone. And once we accept that, another question opens quietly beneath it. If people without cities could coordinate on this scale, what happens when, a little later, some of them start to live together all year, in the same place, with the same tools, the same stories and new ways of recording them? When people begin living together all year, in larger and larger clusters, an invisible problem creeps in. Memory stops being enough for most of our species' history. The world was run on spoken agreements, shared norms, and what everyone could keep straight in their heads. Your band promised to share the next whale with that band. Your uncle owed your mother's brother 3 fine spears. You remembered who had helped you in a lean winter, and who had stolen from your drying rack. In groups of a few dozen, this works. In groups of a few hundred, it starts to strain. In the first real cities, places like Uruk in southern Mesopotamia, or the Nile towns that would grow into dynastic Egypt, you suddenly have thousands of people, many of them strangers, all trying to coordinate water, food, labour and obligations. At that point, forgetting isn't just embarrassing. It's political. Someone has to know how much grain came in after harvest. How much is stored in which warehouse? How many workers are assigned to rebuild the canal next moon? Which temple fields belong to which god? Whose herd grazes on which patch of floodplain? You can imagine the arguments. I brought 10 baskets, not 8. My family has always farmed that plot. We finished our days on the temple project. You miscounted. Out of that rising tangle of claims and counterclaims, writing begins to appear. Not as philosophy, not as epic poetry, as paperwork. The very earliest tablets we found from places like Uruk are mostly about accounts. They list commodities: barley, oil, sheep, beer. They tally rations due to workers, deliveries owed to temples, quantities moving in and out of storage. They use little impressed signs to stand for 1 sheep, 10 jars, field, month. For a while, the system is almost halfway between objects and true writing. People used small clay tokens shaped like cones, spheres, or discs to represent units of grain or livestock. Then they started sealing those tokens inside clay envelopes and marking the outside to show what was inside. Eventually, someone realized you could skip the tokens and just press the marks directly into a flat tablet. From that point, the abstraction tightens. A sign doesn't have to resemble a jar to mean jar. A mark doesn't have to look like a sheep to stand for sheep. Symbols can float free. But it's the mundane needs of an early state that drive this leap. Taxation, storage, labour, property. A centralised authority, king, priesthood, council, wants predictable inflows of grain and goods. Irrigation canals and dikes need coordinated maintenance. Large work projects, temples, palaces, city walls demand scheduled labour. Land and water rights have to be allocated somehow, and once allocated, tracked. Writing lets an institution say, this is what you owe, this is what you gave, this is what we gave you in return. It turns memory into something that can sit on a shelf. What's striking is how late this happens, relative to our mental abilities. By the time the first cuneiform tablets and Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions appear, humans have already been making complex tools, art, jewellery, and ritual sites for tens of thousands of years. They've navigated oceans, tracked the stars, buried their dead with care. Their brains are essentially the same as ours. So why did it take so long? One answer is that language itself is powerful enough that for small and medium societies, you simply don't need more. oral traditions can preserve genealogies going back centuries. Myths, songs, and ritual speech can encode migration routes, seasonal calendars, even resource maps. Leaders, elders, and specialists act as living archives. Writing only becomes worth the effort when the volume and complexity of transactions overwhelm those oral systems, when enough strangers have to trust rules that aren't anchored in face-to-face relationships. That threshold is unusual. Many large, sophisticated societies never quite crossed it, or used writing only lightly. In the Americas, for instance, the Inca built a sprawling empire with roads, terraces, intricate administration, and relied mainly on knotted cords, quipu, as their record system rather than widespread written language. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, city-states and trading networks flourished for centuries with very limited indigenous writing, running everything on memory, messengers, and well-trained orators. On Pacific islands, complex chiefdoms allocated land, organized warfare, and managed ritual cycles without leaving shelves of inscriptions. Writing, in other words, is not a prerequisite for complexity. It's a particular solution to particular problems. And even when writing appears, it is fragile. The earliest archives are piles of clay tablets dried in the sun, or ink on papyrus, or carvings on plastered walls. Clay can crumble, be ground up, and reused as filler. Papyrus rots, burns, or gets recycled into mummy wrappings. Stone can be recarved, smashed, or quarried into new buildings. Fire, which accidentally bakes some clay tablets hard and preserves them, destroys far more. Wars reduce palaces and temples to heaps of rubble. New regimes chisel out the names of old kings, rewrite boundaries, erase old titles. Religious reforms declare certain texts dangerous or heretical and order them destroyed. So when we look at the earliest writing we have, we're seeing only a small surviving fraction. Even that fraction tells us something striking about how early states saw the world. On those first tablets and inscriptions, people are rarely individuals with inner lives. They are roles and quantities, 10 harvest labourers, 3 shepherds, 1 overseer. The gods appear mainly as owners, field of the gods so and so, temple storehouse of such and such deity. This is writing as a technology of extraction and coordination. A way to stabilize obligations across time, to remember who owes what, to make the city's web of duties visible to those who manage it. Only later, gradually, does writing escape the archive and temple office into stories, letters, law codes, self-conscious history. And because the earliest stages are so bound to fragile materials and specific political centres, large parts of that developmental arc can vanish almost without trace. Which means that when we ask how many times writing has been invented, or how many early states experimented with it and then lost it, we're already stretching beyond what the surviving evidence can answer with certainty. Still, what we do see is enough to suggest a pattern. Writing seems to bloom where dense populations, surplus production, and centralized authority intersect. It clings to that intersection tightly. Take away any side of the triangle. Scatter the people, collapse the surplus, or break the central institutions, and the scribes, their schools and their archives, are among the first things to go. And that pattern matters. If we're wondering how many past resets might have quietly erased their own paperwork long before anyone like us had the chance to read it. If the birth of archives depends on a delicate triangle of surplus, cities and central power, their death is even easier to arrange. You don't need an asteroid, you just need someone new in charge. When regimes change, the past becomes negotiable. New rulers inherit not only granaries and palaces, but also shelves of records, chronicles, tax ledgers, ritual calendars, thousands of small brittle arguments about who owns what and who deserves to be remembered. Those arguments are dangerous. If you seize a city, The old land grants in the temple offices contradict your promises to your own supporters. The legal codes on those tablets might say the wrong families have rights. The royal annals might trace legitimacy through a rival dynasty. The sacred hymns might praise the wrong god. So, again and again, conquerors and reformers don't just topple statues. They go for the paperwork. In Mesopotamia, we can see kings boasting about reinscribing monuments, chipping out older names and carving in their own, as if they had built the canals and temples themselves. In Egypt, pharaohs had cartouches of rivals hacked away, so that on temple walls whole figures stand with blank ovals where their names once were. In China, after the Qin dynasty unified the warring states, later tradition remembered an infamous episode, the burning of books and burying of scholars, an attempt perhaps exaggerated in hindsight to standardize texts, eliminate rival philosophies, and reset the intellectual record. Religious revolutions do the same work under a different banner. When Akhenaten in Egypt pushed his radical solar cult, he had other gods' names erased from monuments. When later rulers reversed his reforms, they chiselled him back out of history. In the late Roman world, Christian emperors ordered pagan temples shut and sometimes stripped of their libraries. Centuries later, during the Protestant Reformation, monasteries across Europe were dissolved or plundered, their scriptoria dismantled. Shelves of handwritten manuscripts were sold off as scrap. Ideology gives you a reason. Fire does the rest. But not all erasure is that dramatic. Much of it is slow, almost casual, and driven by simple need. Writing tends to live on whatever material is cheap and available. In Egypt, that was papyrus, strips of reed pressed and dried into rolls. In the Mediterranean, it was parchment, animal skins scraped smooth. In many places, plastered walls and stone stelae carried inscriptions. All of these are useful things, even when you don't care what's written on them. In the dry towns along the Nile, old papyrus tax rolls were cut up to make mummy cartonnage, layered papier-mâché for coffins and masks. In medieval Europe, parchment was so valuable that worn or unnecessary manuscripts were washed, scraped and written over, producing what we now call palimpsests. Beneath a saint's life, modern imaging sometimes reveals an erased medical manual, a lost play, a forgotten technical treatise. Stone too gets recycled. Temples collapse. Their blocks are hauled off to build fortresses and houses. In Rome, the Colosseum and other monuments became medieval quarries. In Athens, sculptures and inscribed slabs were broken up and used as lime for mortar, their texts ground down to hold together new walls. From the point of view of those doing the repurposing, this isn't vandalism. It's maintenance, thrift, survival. But for the future, each practical decision peels away another layer of the written world. Add to this the blunt abrasions of time, mildew, floods, rodents, earthquakes, and absence of evidence becomes the norm, not the exception. Even in famously studied regions, the survival of records is shockingly spotty. Think about how we know classical Athens, a city of tens of thousands literate elites, active courts, a thriving theatre culture. Yet the bulk of its written output is gone. We have a handful of historians, fragments of plays, some inscriptions, a trickle of private letters preserved on papyrus in Egypt by pure climatic luck. We reconstruct its politics and wars from this tiny scattering. Entire genres, popular pamphlets, most courtroom speeches, everyday correspondence have vanished. Or look at the Maya. They carved some inscriptions in stone, but much of their writing lived in folded bark paper codices. Only 4 of those survive, because Spanish missionaries and officials actively burned the rest as pagan texts. The picture we have of a literate, mathematically sophisticated civilization is built on stone fragments and 4 books that happen to escape a bonfire. So what makes anything endure? Dryness helps. The reason we possess so many Egyptian papyri is not because Egyptians were uniquely devoted to preservation, but because their desert climate slows decay. Fire can perversely help too. Clay tablets that would crumble if left sun-dried become nearly indestructible when a palace burns around them, accidentally baking them hard. That's why archives in places like Nineveh and Hattusa survived their own destruction. The buildings burned, the shelves collapsed, the tablets fell into the flames and turned to ceramic. Redundancy helps. Texts that are copied again and again across regions and centuries, like parts of the Bible or Homer or certain law codes, have a higher chance of at least one lineage making it through. Local decrees and tax lists rarely get that treatment, so they disappear. Prestige helps. Grand stone inscriptions carved on temple facades in honor of kings or gods are more likely to be preserved or even protected by later regimes. Every day records quietly disintegrate, leaving us with a history skewed toward the voices of rulers, ritual, and monumental bragging. Faced with this irregular survival, later historians become detectives working with warped evidence. They read inscriptions not only for what they say, but for what's missing, gaps where names have been chiseled out, formulae that hint at older versions we no longer have. They compare copies of the same text from different regions to infer earlier, lost originals. They sift trash heaps, literally. At sites like Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, our knowledge of classical literature and daily life has expanded, because archaeologists dug through ancient rubbish mounds and found discarded papyri, tax receipts, private letters, school exercises, fragments of plays. They also have to correct for bias. Chronicles usually serve the regime that sponsored them. Victories are magnified, defeats minimized or blamed on previous rulers. Whole peoples can vanish from the written story simply because no one with a scribal office cared to record them. Archaeology sometimes rescues these missing actors, pottery styles, house foundations, burial customs, revealing cultures that royal inscriptions barely mention, if at all. This patchwork method, cross-checking texts, artifacts, environmental data, is how we rebuild parts of the past that were never meant to be transparent, and parts that someone worked very hard to bury. It's also why, when we glance across the ruins of earlier ages and see empty stretches with no writing, we should be cautious about assuming nothing complex was there. The record is not a neat continuous scroll. It's a charred, palimpsested, recycled thing. Whole archives have burned, been scraped, wrapped around mummies, and built into walls. What we hold are the surviving scraps, and those scraps are enough to prove one unsettling point. You don't need a world-ending cataclysm to erase centuries of memory. Ordinary politics and ordinary scarcity can do it on their own, which raises another question as we move forward. If that much can vanish in places we know were literate, how much might have appeared, flickered for a few generations, and gone completely dark in regions where we've barely begun to dig? If ordinary politics can scrape out a century here and there, what happens when the politics, the economy, and the climate all fail at once? To see that, we can fast forward from scattered tablets and recycled stone to one of the most dramatic pile-ups in the ancient record, the Late Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was crowded with powers that, from their own perspective, were anything but fragile. There was New Kingdom Egypt, with its temples striding along the Nile, the Hittite Empire in central Anatolia, ruling from the fortified city of Hattusa, the Mycenaean palaces in Greece, Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, with their storerooms full of perfumed oil and bronze weapons. To the east, the Kassites in Babylonia, the Assyrians pressing outward, the city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast acting as a kind of shipping hub for everyone else. They all knew each other, they wrote to each other, they married into each other's dynasties, We still have some of their correspondence. Kings addressed one another as brother, sent gifts of gold, horses and luxury goods, and complained when the presents weren't up to standard. Merchants moved copper from Cyprus, tin from faraway mountains, grain from Egypt, textiles from Mesopotamia. Scribes recorded cargoes, rations, and diplomatic treaties. What joined these societies was not just geography, but interdependence. A Mycenaean war chariot rolling along a coastal road in Greece depended on Hittite control of inland routes, on mining communities hundreds of miles away, on Cypriot smelters, on shipbuilders and sailors who might never see a palace in their lives. Hittite iron, Egyptian grain, Levantine timber, Mesopotamian wool, each region leaned on the others. That web was their strength. It let them specialize, grow rich field professional armies. It also meant that when one strand snapped, the vibrations ran everywhere. Between about 1220 and 1130 BCE, the tablet record thins and then, in many places, stops. Fortified cities are burned, palaces are abandoned. Trade routes fall silent. Later Greeks looked back on this gap as a kind of dim age before their own classical story begins. Modern historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. There is no single neat cause we can point to, no lone invader or lone drought. Instead, we see multiple stressors hitting the system in close succession. Climate records pollen in lake mud, isotope ratios in cave stalagmites, suggest a shift toward drier, more variable conditions in parts of the eastern Mediterranean. Harvests became less reliable. Famine inscriptions appear in Egypt. Letters from Ugarit mention grain shortages and desperate requests for food shipments. At the same time, populations were on the move. In the inscriptions of the pharaohs we meet mysterious sea peoples, coalitions of migrants and raiders arriving by land and by boat. Some may have been displaced groups from the Aegean or western Anatolia, pushed outward by their own local crises. Others might have been opportunistic bands taking advantage of weakened coastal defences. From the viewpoint of the palace scribes, all of this appears as invasion and threat. Foreigners burning cities, cutting trade routes, demanding land. From the viewpoint of the people doing the moving, it may have been survival, seeking new homes as their own fields failed or their own rulers fell. Layered onto climate and migration was internal strain. These palace economies were top-heavy. Elites lived on flows of grain, livestock, and manufactured goods extracted from peasants and channeled through central storehouses. Maintaining that system meant armies, bureaucrats, and scribes on payroll. When harvests faltered or caravans stopped arriving, that whole apparatus shook. We see hints of local revolts, breakaway regions, vassals shrugging off their overlords. Treaties go unanswered. Previously loyal cities hedge their bets. In a more isolated world, each kingdom might have absorbed its own crisis, shrunk a little, regrouped, but because they were so enmeshed, militarily, diplomatically, economically, their misfortunes synced up. A cut in copper shipments from one island meant fewer bronze weapons for another kingdom's army, making it harder to defend its ports, making it easier for raiders to disrupt yet more trade. Grain shortages in one region meant more demand on another, which was already under strain. The system entered what we would now call a cascade. From our side of the timeline, that cascade looks like a wall. We go from elaborate diplomatic archives to almost nothing. From monumental inscriptions boasting about imperial campaigns to scattered local texts. In some areas, writing disappears entirely for centuries or survives only in a different, simpler script used for more limited purposes. This is where the idea of a dark age creeps in. When the palaces stop writing, the story seems to stop. Archaeology shows smaller settlements replacing great centres, cheaper materials replacing luxury imports, simpler graves instead of monumental tombs. To a historian peering through the narrow straw of surviving evidence, complexity appears to collapse. But complexity doesn't vanish. It reorganizes. In the rubble of burned palaces, archaeologists find not only destruction layers, but continuity, local pottery traditions persisting, farming communities still tending fields around the ruins, new kinds of houses built with old stones. Metalworking never disappears. It becomes more local, less standardized. Trade doesn't end. It reroutes along shorter, safer paths. Some migrants settle and become new elites. Old ethnic labels fade. New identities form. The alphabetic scripts that later Greeks and Phoenicians use may grow out of experiments in writing during these unsettled centuries. Simpler, more flexible systems better suited to a world without massive palace schools. Religion shifts too, but doesn't simply reset. Old gods merge with new. Local cults persist in shrines that have been in use for generations, even if the royal patrons who once funded them are gone. To someone living through it, the late Bronze Age collapse would not have felt like the end of civilization so much as an exhausting, dangerous era of loss and adaptation. Fewer long-distance luxuries, more local improvisation, new neighbours, strange weapons, old certainties eroding. Yet, out of that turbulence, later civilizations grew. The Phoenician trading cities, the small kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the city-states of classical Greece, all of them inhabit landscapes shaped by the collapse. They build on old routes, reoccupy old sites, quarry blocks from Bronze Age ruins. They inherit not only the trauma, but the techniques that survived. Shipbuilding knowledge, farming practices, mythic stories whose origins lay in the palatial world that burned. For our purposes, this episode offers a quiet warning. A networked, interdependent set of societies can withstand many small shocks. It can look very stable from the inside, and then several stresses line up. Climate flickers, migration increases, conflicts multiply, and a structure that seemed permanent can downshift in a few generations to something that, in the archaeological record, looks like a shadow of what came before. Not because people forgot how to be complex, but because their old way of being complex was too tightly tied to a particular arrangement of trade, power, and climate. When we think about resets, about vanished levels of organization, the late Bronze Age collapse reminds us to look not only for single cataclysms, but for tangled chains of cause and effect. And it suggests another lesson as we move forward. Even where the written lights go out, cultural embers are still glowing, ready under the right conditions to flare up into a new pattern of civilization that may only dimly remember the one that came before. One of the easiest illusions to fall for from our modern vantage point is that technology is a staircase. Once you climb a step, you never go back down. But history doesn't work like a straight staircase. It looks more like a series of ramps and switchbacks, with skid marks. To see why, imagine those Bronze Age palaces again, not as stone shells but as humming machines made of people. Every tool you've seen in a museum case, a bronze sword, a chariot wheel, a carved ivory box, stands on top of a pile of invisible specializations. Somebody had to know where the copper was, and how to get it out of the ground. Somebody else knew how to dig safe shafts, how to keep fires lit underground, how to shore up tunnels so they didn't collapse. Others understood how to smelt ore, how hot the furnaces had to be, which charcoal burned best, which fluxes made the metal separate cleanly from slag. Tin came from somewhere entirely different, maybe hundreds of miles or even continents away. It had its own miners, its own caravans, its own middlemen who knew which mountain passes were safe in which months. Then there were smelters who understood the right proportions to mix copper and tin into bronze, suitable for weapons versus bronze for mirrors, versus bronze for bells. Over that stood the toolmakers and armourers, the wagon builders, the leather workers, the scribes tracking shipments, the accountants noting who owed what, the overseers making sure each link in the chain did its part. When you look at a single artefact, you're seeing the last, shiny, quiet endpoint of a whole song of knowledge that runs through a society. That is what specialization means. It's powerful. It lets communities do things no single group of generalists could manage. It also makes the system fragile in a particular way. Because if your sword depends on copper from Island A and tin from Mountain B, moved by Ship C, recorded by Scribe D, financed by Palace E, defended by Garrison F, then you don't just need metalworking, you need the whole song. If enough notes drop out, if ships stop sailing, or caravans are too dangerous, or palaces can't pay their specialists anymore, the song doesn't just get quieter. Parts of it go silent. When that happens, people don't become stupid. They become practical. A village blacksmith who once repaired fine bronze fittings might suddenly face a world where no one can get tin. Faced with that, he doesn't reinvent the long-distance tin trade. He hammers old bronze scrap into crude tools as long as he can, then turns more and more to iron, or even to wood and bone. The record from the end of the Bronze Age and other collapses shows this pattern clearly. We see exquisite imported goods vanish from the archaeological layers, replaced by simpler local pottery and tools. We see standardized, mass-produced artifacts give way to more varied homemade ones. We see writing shrink from complex logographic scripts, requiring years of training, to shorter phonetic alphabets or disappear for a while in some regions. That disappearance of literacy is not theoretical. After the Mycenaean palaces fell, the Linear B script used to keep their bureaucratic records vanishes. For centuries, Greece is archaeologically illiterate again. People still speak complex languages, still tell myths, still remember heroes and gods. They just don't maintain the narrow class of professional scribes needed to keep a complicated script alive. The knowledge is not destroyed by some mysterious force. It simply becomes too expensive, in time and resources, for a smaller, poorer, more local society to support. Craft knowledge can erode the same way. Think of shipbuilding. A Bronze Age port might host families who've built seagoing vessels for generations, with accumulated tricks about hull shape, sail rigs, seasonal winds. Lose the large fleets, the far voyages, the need for big cargo capacity, and a community may still build boats, but rivercraft, fishing skiffs, small coasting vessels. To an archaeologist 1,000 years later, this can look like a loss of maritime technology. In reality, it's a rational response to changed conditions. Long-distance shipping is dangerous and unprofitable. Local fishing keeps you alive. Rebuilding after a crash usually means starting from what you can control directly. Nearby forests, local clay, iron ores easy to reach, crops that grow in your climate without elaborate irrigation systems. Dense, centralized technologies, ones that require vast bureaucracies, rare materials, or elaborate logistics, are the ones that tend to vanish first. Precision bronze metallurgy, monumental stone quarrying on an imperial scale, palace-based writing systems tied to a specific court. What tends to persist are flexible, small-scale skills, basic farming, blacksmithing, with whatever metal is to hand, weaving, pottery, herbal medicine, house building in local styles. These can ride out political collapses because they live in households and villages, not just in palaces and archives. From the inside, people are improvising, downgrading, patching together what they remember with what's available. From the outside, with centuries of distance and only scattered ruins to look at, the curve can seem steeper. We might see a decorated bronze sword in a museum. Then layers from later centuries where only iron knives and simple farm tools survive. Without knowing the intervening story, that jump can look like a hard reset, a mysterious rise, then a baffling fall. Add another few centuries, erase some layers with erosion or later construction, and you get something even stranger in the record. Partial continuity that looks like a total break. An alphabet that appears from nowhere, when in fact it evolved from a now lost scribal experiment. A style of masonry that seems more refined than what comes centuries later nearby, because the chain of specialist builders broke and then slowly recoalesced. A myth that remembers great ships and burning cities, told by people whose own boats never leave sight of shore. When we look back and see technology going backwards, we don't have to invoke forgotten super-civilizations with magic tools. We can start with something far more human, tightly tuned systems, stretched over long distances, suddenly forced to shrink. People choosing, under pressure, to trade a little brilliance for a lot of reliability. And sometimes hundreds or thousands of years later, their descendants stumbling on the old stones and wondering who, exactly, had built so well before them. In the next part of our drift through time, we'll look at those stones more closely, the blocks and pillars that feel out of place, the masonry that looks too good, and why it's so tempting to see in them the fingerprints of a lost higher age. Walk up to one of those old stones in your mind for a moment. Not the polished marble of a classical temple, but the heavy, rough giants, the circles at Stonehenge, the stacked terraces at Sacsayhuaman, the long galleries at Baalbek. Blocks the size of cars, sometimes buses, sitting exactly where someone wanted them to sit thousands of years ago. What's impressive about them doesn't require anything supernatural. Just imagine, slowly, how much coordination it takes for a community without engines or steel cranes to decide, as a group, we are going to move that 20-ton rock from there to there. First, they have to agree that it's worth doing at all. That means shared beliefs, shared goals, enough food security, that dozens or hundreds of people can spend days or weeks on a project that will never feed them, never pay them back directly. That's already a level of social surplus and organisation that not every society ever achieves. Then there's the practical side. Someone has to know where suitable stone is, not just any boulder, but material that splits the right way, weathers well, stands up without crumbling. Another person knows how to open the quarry, where to cut, how to wedge, which season the rock breaks most predictably. Those decisions leave traces. If you look closely at many megalithic sites, you can see the quarry, sometimes a few hundred meters away, sometimes miles distant. You can follow the scars in the hillside, the half-finished blocks still attached to bedrock, the wedge holes where timber or stone was driven in to crack the rock along a planned line. Tool marks, too. Chisel traces pecking from hammerstones, parallel grooves where a line of workers laboriously smoothed a surface. Those marks are testable clues. They tell you the hardness of the tools, the angle of the blows, the pace of work. Archaeologists and experimental builders spend a surprising amount of time matching these patterns with replicas, trying methods by hand until the new marks look like the old ones. The same goes for transport. There's nothing mystical about moving big objects with enough people, rollers, sledges, and patience. But exactly how it was done at any specific site is a genuine, open question. Was it done in the wet season when logs slid more easily over mud? In the dry season when ground was firm? Were stones floated part of the way on rafts? Were earthen ramps built and then quarried away again? These aren't armchair puzzles. Researchers build scaled-down versions of the stones, drag them with teams of volunteers, test different rigging systems, try lubricating the ground with water, mud, even animal fat. They measure friction, Record how many people are needed to budge the block an inch. Then compare their results with the likely size of ancient labour forces. It turns out that impossible often means we haven't yet thought through how annoying it would be. The traditions themselves seem to grow like any craft. You don't leap from simple field walls to perfectly fitted polygonal masonry in one generation. Regional styles show gradual change, rougher blocks in older levels, more careful fitting in younger ones. At some Inca-related sites, you can literally walk along a wall and watch the methods evolve stone by stone, as if you're seeing apprentice work next to master's pieces. Megalithic cultures also share family resemblances without being copies of each other. Across Atlantic Europe you find passage graves, standing circles, alignments. In the Andes, terraces and tight-fitting masonry. In the Near East, giant temple platforms. Each region has its own toolkit, its own preferred stone, its own ritual meanings. Knowledge passes down generations, maybe also sideways between neighbouring valleys, refining itself the way any technology does. Small improvements tested, adopted and taught. The trouble comes when we stand in front of the finished, polished version and forget the learning curve. From a distance, ancient masonry can look unnervingly precise. Blocks seem to meet so perfectly you couldn't slide a sheet of paper between them. But close inspection often shows tiny gaps filled with small stones, chinking pieces, clever but very human solutions to irregular shapes. Weathering rounds, edges and blurs, chisel marks, making joints look cleaner than they were on day one. Erosion plays tricks in the opposite direction too. A once sharp inscription can fade until it's nearly invisible. Surfaces can roughen and flake, making a carefully planned corner look like a naturally broken boulder. Then, centuries later, someone finds a still sharp block in a protected spot and decides it must be out of place, alien to the layer it sits in, proof of some unknown builder with unknown tools. The same thing happens with too advanced features. Sometimes a wall in one time and place looks better than walls made centuries later nearby. That doesn't mean the earlier society had lasers and anti-gravity. It can just mean they were willing to spend more labour per stone, or that they happened to have a particularly skilled guild of masons, or that later builders were patching things on a tighter budget with different priorities. There are, to be fair, questions that aren't fully settled. How exactly were some of the truly massive blocks at Baalbek manoeuvred into position? How were certain tight interior spaces ventilated and lit during construction? In what sequence were multi-ton lintels raised and then adjusted? Different researchers propose different sequences of ramps, scaffolds, levers, counterweights. Some argue for huge ramps that were later dismantled. Others suggest compact, switchback ramps wrapped closely around the structure. Some favour levering stones up incrementally, cribbing with timber. None of these options gets unanimous support. Each has trade-offs in labour, material and space. But that's how the field works. Not as a competition between it's impossible and aliens did it, but between multiple testable human methods. Megaliths are impressive, precisely because they sit in the narrow zone between hard but doable, and beyond any single person's lifetime. They required communities willing to commit generations to a project, to refine quarrying techniques, transport tricks, and masonry details over and over until the stone finally stayed where it was meant to stay. When we see them as the endpoint of long local traditions rather than dropped in miracles, something interesting happens. The question shifts from who secretly built this to how many hands over how many lives, fed and trained and organised, did it take for this one stone to be standing here now? And from there it's a short step to other puzzles, not stones, but knowledge etched into the sky. Star patterns, maps, calendars that seem too careful, too mathematical for primitive people. In the next stretch of our drift, We'll lie back beneath those ancient skies and watch how far human eyes and minds could reach, even without a single written equation. Lie back for a moment on the ground beside those stones and look up. For most of human history, the sky was the biggest, sharpest thing anybody owned. No light pollution, no city glow, just a dome of stars that rose and set with the kind of regularity you could bet your life on. And people did. Astronomy doesn't start as science in the modern sense. It starts as, do we plant now or do we starve later? And if we sail when that star rises, do we hit the right shore or disappear? If you're a farmer on a floodplain, one bad guess about the seasons can cost everything. You can't afford to be vague about spring. You want to know when the river is likely to rise, when the rains usually begin, how long between planting and harvest. So you watch. You notice that certain stars rise just before dawn at particular times of year. You tie them, in memory, to smells and sounds, the first frogs, the first warm wind, the time when last year's grain bins were almost empty. You pass those associations to your children. Over generations, the pattern gets sharper. This is where complex calendars really come from. Not from a single flash of genius, but from hundreds of years of people keeping track, out loud and in ritual, of how sky and earth move together. You don't need telescopes for this. You need patience, stable traditions, and someone whose job it is to care. In many early societies, that job lands on priests, temple keepers, or specialist elders. They're the ones who remember which days are taboo, which nights require a fire on the hill, which star must be visible over the temple gate before you start the harvest ritual. If they're wrong too often, everyone notices, so they refine. At first you might just divide the year into when the river rises and when it falls. Then you notice the moon, a countable cycle, waxing and waning, about 30 days from full to full. You start counting months between big events. Sooner or later, you hit an annoying fact of nature. The moon doesn't line up neatly with the year. 12 lunar months come up short. 13 run too long. The seasons slowly drift out of sync with your festival days. Fixing that mismatch is where things start to look advanced. Some cultures solve it by adding an extra month every so often. Not randomly, but on a schedule discovered by trial and error. If you insert a leap month 7 times every 19 years, the lunar cycle and the solar year stay roughly aligned. That's not mystical. That's what happens when people pay close, careful attention to the sky for a very long time. Mathematical sophistication doesn't require steel or electricity. It requires notation, memory, and time. The Maya, for instance, developed multiple interlocking calendars, a 260-day ritual cycle, a 365-day solar year, and long counts that could project dates thousands of years into past or future. They tracked eclipses with enough precision to predict them. Yet there were no telescopes, no algebra textbooks, no slide rules, just naked eyes, horizon markers, and generations of priests or scribes carrying tables in their heads and on bark paper books. Similarly, Polynesian navigators memorized night skies as if they were maps. For them, stars weren't abstract points of light. They were directions, each one rising and setting along a known path. By learning which constellations sat where, at which time of night, they could sail hundreds or thousands of kilometers across open ocean, aiming not for a line on a drawn chart, but for a pattern of rising stars. When people today hear that, it can feel like magic. But again, it's a different flavor of knowledge, not a different species. Industrial technology is about harnessing stored energy, coal, oil, waterfalls, atoms to do work. Mathematical and observational sophistication is about patterns. What repeats, what lines up, what can be counted and predicted. You can have one without the other. A society with no metal tools can still develop exquisite mental maps of coastline, prevailing winds, currents and stars. A city without steam engines can still build observatories aligned to solstices and equinoxes, tracking the subtle wobble of seasons within seasons. The hardware stays simple: stone, wood, shadow, water clocks. The software, the mental models, can be startlingly intricate. The question then becomes, how do you keep that software from degrading? Without printing presses, data lives in people, in their stories, rituals, songs and training systems. Priesthoods, in many cultures, function like living libraries. Apprentices watch seniors perform rituals, recite genealogies, mark the days. They're drilled not just in what to remember, but in how: fixed phrases, rhythms, repeated structures that make errors stand out. A mispronounced syllable in a long chant can be as jarring as a wrong note in a familiar song. Mnemonic systems grow up around this need. Think of verse instead of prose, myth instead of manual. To encode a cycle of eclipses, you don't say every 223 lunar months. You tell a story about dragons devouring the sun on a schedule, each visit counted out in a sacred sequence. To remember which stars matter for planting, you weave them into the deeds of a culture hero whose journey across the sky mirrors the agricultural year. To modern ears, those sound like just myths, but inside them may sit very concrete, tested rules of thumb about tide cycles, monsoon onset, animal migrations. When anthropologists look closely at some indigenous knowledge systems today, they find layers of environmental data folded into narrative memory in exactly this way. So when people claim that ancient civilizations had advanced knowledge, perfect star catalogues, maps of the whole globe, precision better than ours, it's worth asking, compared to what, and how do we know? For a claim to be persuasive, it needs more than a striking coincidence or a poetic alignment. If someone argues that an ancient map shows Antarctica ice-free, we can test that. We can compare coastlines, check projections, examine the transmission history of the manuscript. Are there intermediate copies? Are the errors consistent with known copying mistakes? Does the mapmaker label other regions in ways that reflect their own time and geography? If someone says a temple encodes the precession of the equinoxes, that slow 26,000-year wobble of Earth's axis, we can check for consistent, repeated design features across many sites, not just one or two striking alignments. We can ask whether the required time span for observation fits the culture's known history, and whether simpler explanations exist. Advanced knowledge in the cautious historical sense shows patterns, systematic measurements, progressive refinement, explicit rules that can be reconstructed from surviving texts, instruments or architecture. It isn't just this number kind of matches that modern value. That doesn't mean the ancients were limited or dull. It means they were human, like us, with some domains of extraordinary focus and others where they were simply guessing. They could be brilliant about the stars that affected their crops and voyages, and completely unaware of continents they'd never seen. They could time solstices to a day, yet have no concept of bacteria. When we remember that, a more interesting picture appears. The sky becomes not evidence of a vanished industrial civilization, but a record of how far pattern-seeking minds can go, armed only with eyes, stories and time. Maps become not proof of secret satellites, but snapshots of how far trade, rumour and exploration reached before compasses and chronometers. And this in turn sets a baseline. If a previous reset civilization had existed with truly global industrial-level science, we'd expect to see more than just good star lore and clever calendars. We'd expect certain fingerprints, artifacts, residues, anomalies that go beyond what human communities can achieve with patient observation alone. Those fingerprints are what we'll turn to next, when we follow genes and languages, the invisible maps inside our bodies and words, to see how often humanity has really moved, mixed and started again. Genes and words are both kinds of memory. Stone remembers the weight of tools. Soil remembers the shape of fields. But DNA remembers who made the tools, who walked the fields, and where their grandparents came from. Language remembers what those people called the wind, the river, the king, the god. Neither kind of memory is perfect. Both can be scrambled. And when they scramble fast enough from far enough away, it can feel on the ground like a reset. Ancient DNA has made this feeling visible. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists looked at pottery styles, burial customs and tool types and tried to decide, did these things spread because people were talking to each other or because one group physically moved in and replaced another? Now we can sometimes check. You dig a grave from 6,000 years ago in Central Europe. You sequence the bones. Then you dig a grave from 4,500 years ago, only a few kilometers away, and sequence again. In several regions, the result is abrupt. The later skeletons carry a very different genetic signature. One population, then centuries later, another population dominant in the same place. This is what geneticists call population turnover, not a gentle blending, but a sharp shift in ancestry. It doesn't mean everyone vanished. It does mean that, over a few centuries, most of the children being born had their roots in a different region than the people buried before. In Europe and parts of South Asia, for example, there is evidence of a substantial influx of people from the Eurasian steppe during the Bronze Age. Before local farmers with one ancestry profile, after pastoralists and their descendants with another profile, often carrying different Y chromosome lineages and new combinations of traits. To a person living through it, this might have felt like an invasion, like a new people arriving with new gods, new weapons, new rules. Villages might be burned, elites replaced, customs overturned. In later myths, this can surface as tales of conquering heroes or ancestors from the north, or people who came by sea. But genetically, it's rarely a clean slate. Even in regions with big turnovers, ancient DNA almost always shows mixing. Local lineages thread into the newcomers and persist. The result is not a simple replacement, but a new blend with a different balance of ingredients. Language adds its own kind of twist. You don't always need a mass migration to change the way people speak. Sometimes you just need a small, powerful group sitting at the top of the social pyramid. Linguists call this elite dominance. A conquering army, a priestly class, a merchant minority can impose their language as the one used for law, trade, and status. Over a few generations, local families may start raising their children in the prestige language because that's where opportunity lives. Genes can stay mostly local, the words can flip almost entirely. Latin, turning into the Romance languages across Western Europe, rode partly on Roman power, roads and administration. In many regions, the bulk of the population descended from pre-Roman peoples, but they ended up speaking Latin and its descendants because that's how you dealt with officials, paid taxes, and joined the army. Later, Arabic spread across North Africa and the Near East through a mix of conquest, religion, and commerce. In many places, the genetic profile remains heavily continuous with earlier populations, but the language landscape changed dramatically. Trade can do this too. A lingua franca, literally Frankish tongue, but more broadly a shared commercial language, can spread far beyond the homeland of its original speakers. Swahili along the East African coast, or Malay in parts of Southeast Asia, carried trade, law, and stories across cultures without erasing the underlying genetic mosaics. From the inside, such a shift can feel like a cultural reset. Suddenly the old stories are told in a new tongue. Old names sound rustic, lower status, backward. Writing, if it exists, follows the prestige language. Future archaeologists digging up tablets or inscriptions might assume a new people arrived, when in fact many of the same families simply switched their public voice. Founder effects and bottlenecks add another layer of confusion. Imagine a small group branching off from a larger population and settling a new region. By chance, they carry only a subset of the original genetic diversity. Maybe one rare trait is common among them, simply because one founding family had many children. Several generations later, their descendants are genetically distinct from the parent population, not because they came from some mysterious other origin, but because they passed through a narrow gate. This is the founder effect, the genetic fingerprint of a small founding group. Bottlenecks work similarly on a larger scale. A drought, epidemic, or war drastically reduces a population. The survivors, by chance and circumstance, carry only part of the previous genetic variation. Their descendants might look, in hindsight, like a new people. But under the surface, most of their ancestry still traces back to the older group. Both founder effects and bottlenecks can make history look more dramatic than it was. When geneticists see a sharp reduction in diversity, followed by rapid expansion, it can be tempting to tell big stories, a conquest, a sudden arrival, a revolutionary technology. Sometimes that's right. Sometimes it's just the echo of a few lucky families having children after a hard time. The same caution applies to language families. When linguists map the relationships among languages, Indo-European, Bantu, Austronesian, they see radiating trees, common ancestors, and expansion paths. These can match roughly what genetic data suggest, but the fit is never perfect. Languages can leap onto new genetic bases. Genes can move without words. Trade, intermarriage, conquest, and prestige can pull them apart or push them together. After a few thousand years, the trail gets fuzzy. This is why genetic and linguistic evidence, powerful as they are, can't by themselves prove or disprove a hidden reset civilization. They can show that people moved, a lot, that whole regions experienced waves of newcomers or suffered bottlenecks and rebuilt, that languages rose and faded, sometimes with, sometimes without, mass movement of bodies. They can't on their own tell you whether those people had steam engines or stone tools or something in between. A new civilization can rise from blended continuity, old farmers, new herders, local fishers, foreign traders, all knitting together into a culture that feels utterly different from what came before. New gods, new kings, new scripts from within. This is year one. From the outside, it's a reconfiguration of older pieces. The danger is overconfidence. It's easy to draw neat arrows on maps, people here, then here, language here, then there, and imagine a single clear story. But migration and language change are noisy. They happen in fits and starts, with local exceptions and strange survivals. For our question, have there been deep resets no one wrote down? Genes and languages don't give a simple yes or no. They tell us that human history is already full of upheavals big enough to feel like endings for the people inside them, and yet, from our vantage point, still part of one long continuous thread. To go further, we have to zoom out again and ask a different question. When people speak of the seventh civilization or the fourth world, what exactly are they counting? And how much of that counting comes from stories, not skeletons or syllables? When people say, we are the seventh civilization, they're not all counting the same thing. Some are thinking of technological plateaus, others of spiritual ages, others of political orders. The number is tidy. The reality underneath is not. The first problem is definition. What do you actually need before you're willing to say, yes, that's a civilization, and not just a culture, a kingdom, or a particularly busy village? Do you demand cities, writing, monumental architecture, complex class hierarchies, and long-distance trade? If you set the bar high, you might only count a handful of true civilizations across the whole planet. The early city-states of Mesopotamia, the Nile, the Indus, the Yellow River, Mesoamerica, the Andes, maybe a few later independent centers. If you set the bar lower, say any large stratified society with regional influence, you suddenly have dozens, even hundreds. Each major dynasty in China, each empire in Mesopotamia, each cycle of centralized and decentralized power in India, in West Africa, in Mesoamerica. And then there's an even trickier category, horizons. Archaeologists talk about horizons when a style, a technology, or a network spreads across many different local cultures at once. The Bell Beaker Horizon in late prehistoric Europe, the international style of the late Bronze Age in the eastern Mediterranean. The Mississippian Horizon in North America, where mound building, iconography, and trade linked far-flung river valleys. These aren't single states with one capital. They're shared patterns that cross political borders. Do those count as one civilization, several, or something in between like the mood of an era, rather than the reign of a specific king? Depending on where you draw the lines, you can make almost any number you want. Over time, people have tried out different counting systems. There are cyclical ages like the Hindu concept of Yugas, where the world passes through golden, silver, copper, and iron ages in a vast repeating rhythm. Or the Greek and Roman idea of successive ages of man, from a lost golden time down to their own, more troubled Iron Age. There are dynastic sequences, especially in places with long written records. Chinese historians, for example, have often narrated their past as a chain of dynasties rising, flourishing, decaying and falling, each with its own mandate from heaven, each cycle a kind of moral lesson about governance and virtue. There are world system eras, the modern social science way to think in big blocks. A world dominated by river valleys and ox carts. A world of Mediterranean sea lanes and caravan routes. A world of Atlantic empires and gunpowder. A fossil fuel world with railways, telegraphs, and then digital networks. In that kind of model, you might talk about a first global system with Bronze Age trade, a second with classical empires, a third with medieval trade webs, a fourth with early modern colonialism, and so on. You can make an argument that we're in the fifth or the sixth or, yes, the seventh phase of an ever-widening global mesh. And then there's our present. Whatever number you assign to it, modern global civilization is odd. For almost all of human history, energy use per person was low. Wood, muscle, a bit of wind and water. Even mighty empires were constrained by how much grain you could grow, how many animals you could feed, how far messages could travel at walking or sailing speed. In the last few centuries, that ceiling blew open. Fossil fuels multiplied the available energy by orders of magnitude. A single modern person with access to electricity, engines, and industrial supply chains effectively commands the work of dozens or hundreds of ancient labourers in the background. Connectivity did the same. Messages that once took months now arrive in seconds. Trade that used to creep along rivers now crosses oceans overnight. Cultures that could once live for generations without direct contact now share memes, music, and markets in real time. And yet the memory of this system is fragile. So much of what defines our age lives in forms that vanish fast. Magnetic domains on hard drives, charges in flash memory, fragile film, cheap paper, plastic that crumbles under sun and time. If you turned off the power and waited a few centuries, the physical record of our digital life would be patchy at best. A clay tablet buried in a ruined palace can wait 4,000 years for an archaeologist. A server rack in a flooded basement cannot. This mixture, unprecedented energy, dense connectivity, brittle data, makes our civilization feel both enormous and strangely temporary. It's easy to imagine it as one distinct world in a series. Before code, after code, whatever comes next. That's where the seventh idea bites. Humans are pattern-seeking animals. We like sequences, stages, arcs. We arrange the past into chapters, the Old Kingdom, the Classical Period, the Renaissance, the Industrial Age. We tell stories that move from innocence to fall, from ignorance to enlightenment, from order to decay. Numbering civilizations feeds that instinct. 7 in particular has a long symbolic history. 7 days of creation, 7 heavens, 7 sages, 7 seals. It feels complete, mystical, just big enough to be impressive, just small enough to hold in the mind before sleep. Calling us the 7th civilization turns the present into a moral episode, 6 attempts before all failed. We stand at the brink of the 7th and final test. Will we repeat their mistakes or finally learn? You can hear the sermon humming under the surface. Don't waste this round. Don't squander the planet. Don't trust progress to be permanent. Used carefully, that can be a useful thought experiment. Imagine earlier large-scale societies as rounds of complexity. For the sake of argument, call the first big river civilizations Round 1, the classical empires Round 2, the medieval and early Islamic and Song networks Round 3, the early modern colonial era Round 4, the 19th century industrial age Round 5, the 20th century fossil fuel explosion Round 6, our digitally entangled world Round 7. You could then ask sober questions. What did each round gain? What did it burn through? How did it handle shocks? What patterns of failure repeat? The number 7 here is not a discovery. It's a frame, a way of pacing the story to notice echoes. The danger is when the frame turns into a fact claim. There is no global inscription listing Civilization I through Civilizations VIX and stamping us as number 7. Archaeology shows many rises and falls, overlaps and partial continuities, not a single synchronized scoreboard. So when we say we might be the 7th, the honest stance is provisional. Not a revelation, but an invitation to think. If there have been multiple rounds of complex societies, each with their own ceilings and crashes, what does that say about ours? If the count is fuzzy but the pattern of fragility is real, how should that shape the way we read both ancient ruins and our own glittering infrastructures? To explore that, we have to look at another question. If there really were one huge global-scale reset in the deep past, something so drastic that no culture wrote it down, why might the story have gone missing? And what traces, if any, would be left behind? Start with the simplest reason. For most of human history, there was nobody around to write anything down. Writing is a late, fussy invention. Anatomically modern humans have been around for roughly 300,000 years. The earliest clear writing systems we know of appear maybe 5,000 to 5,500 years ago in a few river valleys, in a few narrow bands of land. That means for more than 98% of our species' story, every memory was carried in mouths and minds, not in ink and clay. Even after writing appears, literacy stays rare. Scribes, priests, administrators, a few merchants. Most farmers, herders, craftspeople and soldiers never learn to read or write at all. Even in big classical empires, a literate person is still an exception. So if you imagine a single titanic reset far back in time, something that knocked humanity down a rung or two, the odds are it happened in a world that didn't have writing yet, or had it only in a few places. No scribes, no chronicle. And even where writing existed, not every society built libraries or kept systematic records or carved laws in stone. Many complex cultures tracked their past through spoken epics, genealogies and ritual performances instead. Those vanish fast. You also run into a second problem. Disasters aren't evenly distributed. They don't hit everyone at once with the same force in neat cinematic fashion. Climate changes drag on for centuries in some regions and bite hard in others. Epidemics race along certain trade routes and fizzle out elsewhere. Volcanic eruptions bury one coastline in ash, while the people on the far side of a mountain range barely notice. In other words, resets tend to be local or regional, and they tend to be out of sync. While one river system is collapsing under drought, another is booming with new irrigation. While one maritime trade network breaks, a rival over the next sea is just getting started. The late Bronze Age cities of the eastern Mediterranean crumble. Small inland polities and pastoralists move into the gaps. If you live through that kind of patchwork crisis, you don't think, ah yes, the first global reset has arrived, marked clearly in the Book of Ages. You think, our dynasty failed. The gods abandoned this city. Our neighbours invaded at a bad time. Your language for the disaster is local. Your timescale is regional. The story you tell is about your people, your valley, your king. Somewhere else, the story being told is entirely different. That brings us to survivor bias. The cultures whose texts we can still read are, by definition, the ones that did not vanish completely. They were stable enough or lucky enough to keep replicating their script, to copy their stories, to move their sacred books when capitals shifted. The societies that were wiped out so thoroughly that they left no written trace by their nature, leave no written trace. If a literate city on a floodplain is destroyed, its archives soaked, burned, or repurposed as building fill, and nobody with that writing system survives in nearby regions to keep copying the script. Then, within a few centuries, its texts are just strange scratches in buried rubble. From our end, it looks as if nobody ever wrote about the disaster. But it may simply mean the people who did write were exactly the ones most at risk of disappearing, concentrated, centralized, rooted in fragile infrastructures. Then there's the way humans process trauma. When something truly horrible happens, a famine that kills half a generation, a tsunami that scours a coastline, a war that empties whole districts, the first instinct is not always to record it like a neutral weather report. Instead, communities turn it into a story they can live with. Floods become punishments for arrogance or corruption. Plagues become tests of faith, or signs that rituals were neglected. Fire from the sky becomes the wrath of a god, or the result of sorcery, or the opening act in a new age. Over time, the edges of the event blur. The dates slip. Specific place names drop out. What remains is the moral. The city that angered the gods was drowned. The people who ignored the omens were destroyed. The righteous few were saved in a boat, a cave, a mountain refuge. Told and retold for centuries, stretched across languages and borders, these stories stop looking like Chapter 3 of the Great Reset Report and start looking like myths. From our perspective, reading them thousands of years later, it's hard to tell which parts might remember real events and which parts are narrative scaffolding, shaped to teach behaviour rather than to preserve data. And all of this assumes the material record survives long enough for anyone to read it. Most media humans have used to store information as short-lived compared to rock and fired clay. Leather rots, papyrus moulds, wood warps and burns. Ink fades, even baked tablets crack and flake in the wrong kind of soil. Wet, warm climates are especially cruel to records. Insects, fungi and bacteria work tirelessly, day and night, turning books into compost. Floods soak archives into unreadable pulp. Termites quietly hollow out beams and shelves. Then you have fire and conquest. Victors burn enemy records. Libraries become fuel in siege winters. Temples and palaces, which often hold the densest collections of texts, are prime targets for looting and destruction. A few days of chaos can undo centuries of careful record keeping. Even in peaceful times, people reuse materials. Old manuscripts get scraped and overwritten. Stone slabs with forgotten inscriptions get flipped and built into walls. Bronze tablets are melted down for tools and weapons. A carved block that once recorded a king's disaster becomes just another step in a staircase. Layer all of these filters on top of each other: illiteracy, regional timing, survivor bias, mythologized memory, and the simple physical frailty of most recording materials. And the silence around any hypothetical one reset starts to look less mysterious. Not proof that nothing happened. Not proof that something did. Just a reminder that the past is edited twice, first by time and entropy, and then by human storytelling. If we want to seriously imagine a deep, civilization-scale reset, we have to work with that edited record. Which raises the next question, short of a stone tablet labelled, "We restarted here." What sorts of traces would such a reset actually leave behind? If you strip away the drama and the mystery, a reset is really just a pattern in the dirt. Something big happens. Populations crash or move. Habits break. Technologies stall or change direction. Ecosystems flinch. If it's local, the pattern is patchy. If it's truly global, the pattern shows up almost everywhere, like a watermark pressed through the pages of the planet's history. Geologists and archaeologists already know how to look for these patterns. They just don't usually call them resets, they call them markers. The first kind of marker lives in the rocks and the mud, global versus regional signatures. When a volcano really loses its temper, it throws ash high into the atmosphere. That ash drifts around the world, settles out as a thin, distinctive layer. You can sometimes trace the same horizon of ash in lake bottoms, peat bogs, ice cores, and ocean sediments, thousands of kilometers apart. The same goes for really large impacts. Asteroids and comets don't just leave craters. They melt rock, blast debris into space, and sprinkle the planet with tiny glassy droplets called microtectites. They can also scatter elements like iridium at levels much higher than normal crustal background. So if you proposed a reset triggered by, say, a mid-Pleistocene impact big enough to shake human populations everywhere, you'd expect some version of that, a broad band of unusual chemistry. Iridium spikes, weird glass beads, shocked minerals that only form under extreme pressures. If instead you imagine a reset driven by a cluster of regional catastrophes, multiple volcanoes, tsunamis, and abrupt climate swings spread out over centuries, you'd expect a messier picture. Local ash beds here and there, tsunami deposits in some coastal basins, disturbed, jumbled layers where waves tore up earlier sediments and dumped shells, boulders, and plant debris in odd combinations. Global claims, global markers, regional claims, regional markers. That's the basic rule. The next kind of signal comes from where people actually lived. Settlement discontinuities. If a reset really knocked complex societies down a level, you'd expect to see whole regions where sites wink out for a while. Long occupied valleys suddenly empty. Big villages thinning to tiny hamlets. Fortified hilltops abandoned. Then, after some gap, decades, centuries, maybe longer, you might see people move back in. But they don't pick up where they left off. The pottery looks different. House plans change. Burial customs shift. Standardized weights and measures disappear, or new ones appear with no clear local ancestor. Archaeologists already talk about these as cultural breakpoints. In a pottery sequence that's been slowly evolving for 1,000 years, you suddenly get a sharp jump. Old styles vanish, new styles arrive, with a layer of disturbed soil or burnt rubble in between. A true reset would stack these discontinuities across a wide area. Not just one valley, not just one coastal strip, but many different regions showing roughly synchronized abandonment and reinvention. Underneath those breakpoints lies another test, the continuity or rupture of tools and crafts. Technologies have genealogies. You can often trace a line from a crude early form to a refined, standardized version generations later. Clay vessels that start out lumpy and uneven gradually become thinner, more symmetrical, more specialized. Metalworking moves step by step from simple hammered copper to complex alloys and controlled furnace temperatures. If some prior high-tech culture had crashed hard, and we, much later, climbed up again independently, you'd expect to see odd kinks in these lineages, sudden appearances of advanced ceramic recipes with no experimental lead-up. Sophisticated metallurgy that vanishes, followed by long stretches of cruder work as people try to reinvent what they no longer fully understand. You'd also look at measurement. Standardized weights, modular bricks, repeatable units of length. These are the fingerprints of complex administration. If a civilization capable of global-scale building and trade had existed and then fallen, you might see ghost units that crop up in far-flung places, bricks or weights that quietly match each other even after the central system is gone. So far, the craft record tends to show stepwise regional development with a lot of local flavour, not a single broken line from some forgotten peak. But that's the kind of pattern you would check for. Beyond the pots and metals, a reset would echo in the surrounding ecology. Big fires leave charcoal, lots of charcoal all at once, across many cores pulled from lakes, bogs and floodplains. On top of those charcoal spikes you often see pollen shifts, forests giving way to shrubs and grasses, or vice versa as climates change or as people alter landscapes through agriculture or abandonment. Faunal remains tell their own story. Bones of certain animals become more common, then rare, then vanish. New species appear, sometimes associated with human hunting or with habitat recovery, after people disappear from an area. Imagine a world where human land use suddenly collapses. Fields go wild, irrigation networks silt up, grazed hills reforest. In the sediments that might look like a rapid transition from pollen dominated by crops and disturbance-tolerant plants back to pollen from wild trees and native grasses. Large herbivores might rebound. Synanthropic species, those that like living around us, might crash. If a reset was widespread and severe, you'd expect to see coordinated ecological swings like that in multiple regions at roughly the same time. Not proof by itself, but a strong clue that something more than a local war or drought was going on. All of this brings us to the way extraordinary claims should behave. If someone proposes a lost global civilization wiped out 20,000 years ago, that's not just a story. It's a hypothesis, and hypotheses make predictions. You can write them down as a checklist. At such and such date range we should find a distinctive geochemical horizon, broadly distributed, widespread settlement abandonment in multiple regions, within a narrow time band, technological lineages in tools and crafts that show clear breaks, not smooth evolution, ecological signatures of abrupt change that line up with the human disruptions. Then you go looking, in cores, in caves, in old river terraces and drowned coastal shelves. You expect some predictions to fail, some to be ambiguous, some maybe to hold up better than others. That's how science treats resets, not as forbidden questions, but as ideas that have to leave fingerprints. And if a proposed reset leaves no coherent pattern, no ash, no glass, no synchronized gaps in settlement, no breakpoints in technology, no global ecological shudder, then slowly it migrates from the realm of plausible history into the softer realm of story. Not necessarily wrong, not necessarily right. just unanchored. In the end, this is where the fascination lies. We can imagine all kinds of pasts. The planet quietly decides which ones are allowed to be true. So where does that leave the seventh civilization idea? With a mix of signals, some suggestive, some stubbornly ordinary. To make sense of those, we have to pull back and try a gentler synthesis, balancing what the ground actually shows with what our imaginations want to see. If you zoom out over the last 20,000 years or so, the pattern that actually appears isn't one giant spike of mystery, but a whole forest of smaller rises and falls. We see cities that flourish, then empty, irrigation systems that turn deserts green for centuries, then salt the earth and die, trade networks that knit together huge regions, then fray until only local barter remains. Mesopotamia doesn't have one civilization, it has a stack of them. Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, Neo-Babylon, Persian rule, Hellenistic cities, Parthian overlays, Islamic caliphates. Each wave borrows from the last. Scripts are repurposed. Myths are rewritten. Old temples become foundations for new ones. Egypt does something similar. The Old Kingdom's Pyramid Age breaks, then the Middle Kingdom rises, then breaks, then the New Kingdom builds on everything before it. Styles change, gods trade roles, but there's a recognizable through line. China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, the Indus, the Mediterranean, again and again the same rhythm. Collapse, but not amnesia. Ruins, but not an empty slate. That's the strongest, most stubborn signal. History is full of resets, but they are usually partial. More like hard recessions than full bankruptcies. People fall back, reorganize, reuse. Writing systems go quiet, then wake up with new spellings. Old roadbeds become the foundations of new roads. Even when empires die, recipes, songs, crop varieties, and building tricks slip across the gap in the hands of farmers and craftspeople. So what's most likely, if you take the evidence seriously, is many collapses, many continuities, braided together. No single clean line, no single secret reset. Just a noisy overlapping set of human experiments, most of which leave at least some trace. That doesn't mean there aren't missing chapters. The coastlines alone almost guarantee it. For most of the last ice age, sea level was far lower than it is now. The best fishing grounds, the richest estuaries, the gentlest river mouths, they would have sat on what is now drowned continental shelf. We already know that, late in the Ice Age, people built complex sites on land that's still accessible. Think of places like Göbekli Tepe and early coastal shell middens. It would be odd if nobody set up anything sophisticated on the shores that are now 60, 80, 100 meters underwater. Add to that the regions we've barely touched with systematic archaeology, deep parts of the Amazon, interior New Guinea, large swaths of Central Asia, submerged valleys off India or Southeast Asia. Our sample of the past is not just incomplete, it's biased toward what's easy to get to and cheap to dig. So it's plausible, even likely, that there were societies we'd call complex that haven't yet been recognized. Dense villages with planned layouts, early experiments in irrigation or flood management, canoe-based trade networks spanning thousands of kilometers along a coastline that no longer exists. Think of them not as vanished super-civilizations, but as missing regional stories. The kind that might push back the dates for certain technologies, or show that agriculture, seafaring and monumental building were independently invented in more places than we currently realize. What remains speculative is the very big claim, a single planet-spanning civilization, with technology at or beyond ours, that rose before the Holocene and was then almost perfectly erased. Could something large have been wiped out by a combination of sea level rise, impacts, volcanism and time? In principle, yes, But the bigger and more global the system, the more fingerprints it should leave. Durable infrastructure, standardized measures echoing across later cultures, industrial scale changes to chemistry and sediments, global markers that line up in ice and mud. So far, when we look for those, we mostly find what you'd expect from many regional societies, not one integrated world state. Lots of local scripts, local standards, local solutions. Trade, yes. Influence, yes. But not a single lost internet of stone. That doesn't prove such a civilization never existed. It just means the burden of proof sits on the claim, and the planet hasn't yet coughed up the kind of coherent pattern you'd need to move it from story to history. Living with that tension between what's solid, what's plausible, and what's still only imagined requires a particular kind of curiosity. It means being willing to say we don't know without rushing to fill the silence with certainty. Skepticism goes both ways. It's as easy to be dogmatically dismissive as it is to be dogmatically convinced. Instead, you can treat every grand idea as a set of testable expectations. If there was a major coastal civilization 10,000 years before the first known cities, what layers would it leave in the seafloor? What metals, what glass compositions, what patterns of deforestation, what fossils of harbour structures? Then you wait to see whether the cores and surveys start to whisper anything that resembles that prediction. Curiosity, in this mode, is not a hunger for dramatic answers. It's a willingness to keep tuning your questions as new data comes in. And when you look up from the sediment records and ruined cities and drowned shelves, this perspective does something to the way the present feels. You see that our own civilization is not a single, inevitable endpoint. It's just one more dense experiment, perched on coastlines, bound together by trade, powered by delicate systems we assume will keep working. We know now, in a way earlier, cultures did not, how globally entangled we are. A volcanic eruption in one hemisphere can cool crops in the other. A financial crisis can ripple through supply chains that circle the planet. Digital memory feels immortal, but it depends on servers that depend on grids, that depend on politics and weather and rare earth mines. Seeing the past as a series of partial resets and fragile continuities doesn't make a hidden seventh civilization more likely or less. It simply reminds us that whatever number we are in the sequence, we're not exempt from the pattern. Things fall, things endure. Most of what we are will vanish. Some small fraction will thread its way through whatever comes next. And somewhere far ahead, curious minds may sift our traces the way we sift the mud and ash of those who came before, wondering how many stories are still missing, and which questions are safe to leave slightly, deliberately unresolved. So as you drift here, at the end of this long arc, you can look back over the path we've walked tonight. We followed bones and genes, ice cores and tree rings. We watched coastlines slide under the sea. We watched cities flare and fade, scripts appear and go silent. Myths rise out of floods and fires, and then blur into story. We looked at the kinds of evidence that like to last: stone foundations, fired clay, metal corrosion, chemical traces in mud, the slow, indifferent memory of glaciers. And we noticed what almost never survives: cloth and wood, most writing, almost all of the voices, nearly all of the music. Whole languages can rise and die without leaving anything more durable than a few loanwords in somebody else's script. We touched the harsh parts, Bronze Age systems snapping all at once, volcanoes turning noons to twilight, plagues walking along trade routes, river civilizations suffocating on their own salt. We saw how often collapse is not a clean break, but a sag and a fray, with farmers and artisans carrying bits of know-how through the dark. We listened to stories, floods that cover the world, cities in the sky, golden ages and ages of iron. We let the possibility sit there, that sometimes myth is what happens when real disasters and real landscapes echo through 1,000 retellings, and also that sometimes myth is just what humans do when they're trying to make the world feel shaped. We asked why no one ever seems to write down that was the moment the world reset, and the answers, in their quiet way, were simple. Because people in the middle of a disaster don't usually know which catastrophe will be remembered and which will just become background loss. Because when writing is rare and expensive, it is almost never used to record bewilderment. Because those who survive are often more interested in declaring continuity than confessing collapse. New dynasties want to say, we restored the ancient order, not we live among ruins. And because even when people do write these things on clay or bark or papyrus, fire and water and time have more patience than we do. So where does that leave the question that started all of this? Are we living after one enormous global reset that no culture clearly recorded? Or after a long sequence of lesser resets that braided into the story we call history? The calm answer for now is layered. Multiple resets are not speculation. They're the rule. Regional collapses, cultural dark ages, technological backslides and reinventions. We can point to them, dig through them, read their broken inscriptions and abandoned ports. What remains hard to show is a single planet-spanning one reset that wiped away a civilization at or beyond our present complexity. Not impossible in principle, just difficult to reconcile with the patchwork of evidence we actually have. The deeper we look, the more we find complexity appearing earlier than we expected. Planned villages, shared iconography, seafaring, astronomy. The timeline keeps stretching, but it stretches in many strands, not one hidden cable. So, instead of a grand reveal, you're left with something quieter. A world where missing stories almost certainly exist, on drowned shelves, in unexplored interiors, under layers of later building, but where those stories will probably be more about nuanced regional brilliance than about a single erased global age. If you can live with that uncertainty, you get to keep something precious, the question itself. You don't have to choose between mystical truth and closed-case skepticism. You can let the unknown stay slightly open, like a window at night. You can let yourself wonder what lies under a particular bay, or beneath a city's foundations, or inside a hill nobody has ever carefully cut into. And then you can follow the evidence wherever it actually leads, even if it leads somewhere less dramatic and more human than the legends promised. As you're drifting towards sleep, it might be a gentle exercise to place yourself somewhere in that long chain. All your ancestors, bottleneck survivors, farmers on marginal land, sailors on dangerous coasts, scribes copying crumbling texts by lamplight, each carried forward a tiny packet of memory. Not just genes, but habits, tricks, tools, songs, ways of arranging stories about the sky and the sea. You are, in that sense, part of how the past experiments with the future. Some of what you know will vanish with you. Some of what your culture makes will burn, corrode, sink, or simply be forgotten. But some small fraction will thread its way ahead. A book, a recorded voice, a pattern in data, a design copied so many times it becomes anonymous. Maybe that's the soft task of any civilization, 7th or 70th, to notice that it will not last forever, and still do what it can to send useful, kind and honest fragments downstream. If you feel like sharing a tiny part of that stream, you're welcome to leave a note for the future listeners of this channel. Tell us where you are in the world and what time it is as you're hearing this. A city name, a country, 3:17 a.m. Just after sunset. It becomes its own kind of map, scattered across the comments. If this slow dive through deep time helped you rest, or gave you something gentle to think about, tapping like on the video, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel all help these stories keep circulating. And if you'd like to support this project in the simplest, most tangible way, the best place to do that is by listening on Spotify. The link is waiting down in the description. Let it play while you fall asleep, or while you commute, and it quietly tells the algorithm that these long, careful wanderings through history are worth sustaining. For now, as you let your eyes grow heavier, you can imagine the future archaeologists of whatever comes after us, sifting through layers of glass and plastic, concrete and code, trying to piece together a story from whatever fragments endure. Somewhere in that far-off work, maybe a trace of this moment will remain, that once, in the early digital age, people lay in the dark, listening to old questions about lost civilizations, and choosing gently to keep the question open and the wonder intact. Sleep well whenever and wherever you are. And when you wake, if you remember, come back, tell us where you were listening from and what time it was for you. Like, comment, subscribe if you'd like to travel further with these stories. And if you want to quietly keep this little archive alive, press play on Spotify and let the past and the future keep talking to each other just beyond the edge of dreams.